This is The Vampire Tales, Dusk Shadows, Fae Wilds Series, Book 7 by W.J.May. Copyright 2023 by W.J.May. Narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 13. She was jerked back, landing on her back. The feeling of those clammy, rotting hands on her skin panicked her. Hollie dug in her heels, trying to hold herself in place, but the creature had a grip on her hair and was dragging her toward him. She shoved her arms into the mud, her fingers scrambling to find a root she could grab. But the zombie who had her was too strong and the mud too slippery. "He's going to bite me any second now. One bite and it's game over." Terror overwhelmed her, but she refused to stop fighting. Hollie managed to flip herself over so that she was on her belly, then scrabbled to her knees, sitting back on her heels and dropping all of her weight into her trunk. The zombie dragging her stumbled, and its grip faltered. But before Hollie could get to her feet, another one shoved at her, pushing her over. "Don't bite me, don't bite me, don't bite me." It was a litany on a loop in her mind, her limbs shaking, her heart pounding. She was certain she'd feel those disgusting teeth piercing her skin at any second. But the more seconds that passed without a bite, the better able she was to get herself under control. Harnessing the adrenaline flowing through her, she flexed muscles she'd only used for the lightest of aerobics before, fighting like a wild animal against her captors. A well-placed kick sent the zombie who'd been gripping her legs backwards onto its ass. The mud she'd covered herself with during the struggle worked to her advantage this time. The corpse couldn't keep its decomposing hands on her. The one in front still held her hair. Despite the pain, Hollie pivoted around to drive her feet into its knees, knocking the creature over. Grabbing her hair closer to the root, she yanked against its grip. Her enemy wasn't willing to give an inch, but neither was Hollie. Screaming out in agony, she ripped herself away. Turning back, she saw that the zombie still held a fistful of hair in its crumbling fingers. "I'm free," she told herself, ignoring the pain. She made it to her feet, gauging her chances of running past the pair, who were already closing in again. "It'll be just like football," she told herself, remembering watching the games with her father when she was young. He would sit on the sofa, and she'd sit on the floor beneath him, parking herself between his legs. "Even though I've never touched the pigskin in my life, I'm going to channel my inner running back." She prepared to run, but a streak of light rushed past her, embedding itself in one of her opponent's heads. It crumpled, a nasty gray goo seeping out of the crater in its skull. A loud shriek sounded, and she turned to see Phaedra descending from above to lob off the head of the other. Hollie watched it tumble and bounce before rolling to a stop next to the roots of a grizzled tree. Her gorge rose again, but she prevented herself from vomiting, just barely. Phaedra rushed at her, coming to a landing in front of her. "Are you bit?" she asked, frantically patting Hollie down, looking for teeth marks. "If you're bit, tell me now, and I'll make your ending quick." "Thanks, but no thanks," Hollie said, slapping her hands away. "They didn't bite me." Cass appeared, followed closely by Taylor. The witch's face was blank, but her dark eyes were lit with intensity. The Fae, however, was already weeping. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, clutching at Hollie. "I tried to help you, but they swarmed me. And now you're bitten by zombies and you're... "I'm not bitten," Hollie told her gently. "See?" She lifted her arms and turned around slowly. "No bites, no scratches." "Impossible," Cass said, coming closer to inspect Hollie herself. When she had made certain she was telling the truth, the witch shook her head. "They grabbed her, pulled her into the forest, but didn't bite her. Why?" Phaedra scowled, her expression black. "They were working together, the two of them. They were kidnapping her." "Kidnapping her?" Taylor sounded as confused as Hollie felt. "Zombies don't kidnap people. They eat them." "Even more reason to go to the High Council," Cass said. "They need to be alerted of this immediately." "You and your precious council," Phaedra muttered. "While you and your coven natter on, we're going to get the hells out of this cursed realm." "No, you are not," Cass replied, puffing herself up and staring down the Fae. "I already told you." "And I told you I don't give a leaf about your council. We're leaving." Still shaking from the fear and adrenaline, Hollie's nerves were shot. She put 2 fingers between her lips and whistled loudly to shut them up. "I see the two of you have beef, but now isn't the time to debate. What's to say there aren't more of those things out there, working their way towards us while you stand here and bicker?" 3 sets of eyes looked at her, and Hollie could tell they were considering her words. "She's right," Taylor said, putting a conciliatory hand on both of the other women's arms. "We can make a decision when we reach town, where we should be headed immediately." They moved quickly, Phaedra and Cass putting their argument on hold in the interest of self-preservation. Silence seemed wise, given they didn't know who or what might be around them, waiting for the opportunity to ambush them. The absence of talk gave Hollie's mind peace to run wild with worry. Zombies always bite their prey, but they didn't bite me. It was pretty clear from the other women's reactions that they'd expected Hollie to be toast. They were trying to kidnap me, according to Taylor. Why would a horde of zombies be after me, and who would they be taking me to? The image of the fanged hunk of her nightmares appeared in her mind, and Hollie blinked. Weariness weighed down her shoulders. The vampire. He's the one who's been pursuing me relentlessly. This is just another example of his handiwork. Whether I'm asleep or awake, he just can't leave me alone. And if he knows I'm here, it's only a matter of time before he comes for me himself. Her eyes flickered to the horizon, where the sun was hanging low. It wouldn't be more than a couple of hours before the sun set and night fell. Hollie didn't like the direction of her thoughts, and she was relieved when they stepped off the path and into the alleyway, transitioning from forest to city. Phaedra approached the witch, not wasting a second. "Take us back to your house immediately. We're getting out of here." "Of course," Cass said, her smile wide. "Just after I do this." Almost quicker than Hollie could see, the witch pulled her hand out of her pocket and lifted it, opening it to flick golden dust into Phaedra's face. The Fae blinked twice, then a hazy grin spread across her face. "You don't want to go to my house, do you?" Cass asked. "You want to go to that tavern over there and wait for me to return, don't you?" The normally stern warrior woman nodded, a girlish giggle escaping her lips. "Yes, I do." She turned to Taylor and put her arm around her. "Doesn't that sound wonderful?" "Absolutely wonderful," Taylor agreed, then started across the street toward the tavern. "I, for one, could certainly use a drink." "What did you do to her?" Hollie asked the witch as they followed after the pair of Fae. "Nothing that will harm her. The dust just makes her a little more agreeable for a limited time." Cass flashed a grin at her. "She'll be back to her old angry self soon enough." Hollie let out a breath of relief, then trailed the witch into the tavern. The gold-painted letters painted above the door named it the Bubbling Brew. Hollie froze, noticing that the letters seemed to be sending up little bubbles periodically into the air in front of it. I don't know if I'll ever get used to all this magic. The inside of the establishment was clean if crowded. A lively dice game was in progress in one of the corners, the other tables filled with patrons of all varieties, from a pair of satyrs discussing the virtues of various pipes to a massive being with the muscular body of a human and the head of a bull. "Is that—" "A minotaur," Cass filled in for her. "Yes, it is." "I thought it lived in a labyrinth," Hollie said, confused, recalling the old myth of the violent beast. "I suppose one of them got stuck in a maze once upon a time," the witch answered. "But there's more than one minotaur. There's an entire race of them, and on the whole they're more erudite than most species you meet in the web." Hollie noticed the creature was wearing glasses, which he pushed up onto his nose in the classic nerd gesture. You learn something new every day, she thought. Being around these Fae, I learned several new things seemingly every minute. Their companions were already at the long, polished wood bar speaking to the bartender, who appeared to have a monkey-like tail. "1 ice wine for me and a cup of tea for my friend," Taylor told him. Phaedra, her elbows on the bar, chin resting on her fists, grinned sappily at the barkeep. "I bet you can do a lot of fun things with that tail," she told him. Cocking her head, she spoke, her words ringing with sincerity. "You know, I always wished I had a tail." "You've got wings," the bartender responded while pouring their drinks. "Don't get greedy now." "What's wrong with being greedy?" Phaedra said, and watching him set a small ceramic cup of tea in front of her. "Who wants this?" she said, her expression offended. "I want a pretty drink like hers." She pointed to Taylor's drink with a look of longing. It took a lot of strength for Hollie not to burst out laughing at the Fae's antics. Cass put a hand on her shoulder. "I've got to go to the council. Please be sure you stay here. I'll come back as soon as I can." Is here safe? Hollie asked, looking around, paying special attention to any shadows. He always seems to come out of the shadows. As safe as I can make it, Cass told her. I'll put a hex on the door when I leave. If a vampire passes through the threshold, I'll be instantly alerted and will return instantly. The witch looked tired. Hollie worried that the hex wouldn't be enough protection. Her ritual failed. What's to say her hex won't too? Are you sure you're up to this? Fighting off those zombies must have taken a lot of power. Cass looked at her. You don't think I'm up for it? She sniffed. Don't worry. I've always got another trick up my sleeve. At those words, she reached into her sleeve and pulled out a shiny gold coin. Don't spend this. Consider it your emergency escape hatch. What? Hollie stared down at the coin. Its heads were identical. A sunburst surrounded by a border that resembled waves. What does it do? In an extreme emergency, you can clutch it in your palm and say the word Vinaya. The first place you think of, that's where you go. Use it wisely because wherever you end up, you're going to stay. Cass looked to the door before looking back. I've got to go. The High Council needs to know what was lurking in the woods. Hollie watched the witch depart, seeing her touch her hand to the doorframe and pause before departing a few moments later. A feeling of exposure flooded her. Without the witch in Phaedra's current state, who will protect me when the vampire appears? She felt the coin's weight in her hand, and in that moment she considered using it to flee. But she remembered the witch's warning. She should only use it if it was an extreme emergency. Slipping the coin into the pocket of her shift dress, Hollie moved to stand beside the Fae women at the bar. I bet you can do some neat tricks with that tail, Phaedra was telling the bartender, a fizzy pink concoction resting in front of her. Why don't you show me something? Gladly, the barkeep, leaning over the bar and waggling his eyebrows. I get off in 3 hours. What say we get a room and I'll show you all of my tricks? Taylor was mid-sip, and at his words she spit out a mouthful of wine all over the bar. Phaedra, however, just giggled. Can I touch it? I hope you do, he said, dropping a sleazy wink. Phaedra giggled again, too affected by the dust to realize the subtext of the conversation. A conversation which felt surreal to Hollie after their battle in the woods. What could possibly happen next to make this day any weirder? Hello again, gorgeous! Hollie spun around to find a blonde-haired man from the Spell ingredient shop standing beside her. He was just as attractive as before, and this time, Phaedra wasn't in a fit state to stand in the way of their flirting. Oh, boy. I thought you were leaving, he said, gently chastising her. If you weren't interested in sharing a meal with me, you could have told me. I can handle rejection. I'm a big boy. Something in his demeanor charmed her, just like last time. I didn't reject you, at least not in the way you're talking about. I did leave, but I came back unexpectedly. Jude cocked an inquisitive eyebrow. So many things to unpack in that statement. But let's start with the whole not rejecting me thing. Does that mean dinner is on? Hollie opened her mouth to politely refuse, but her stomach had other thoughts. I suppose I haven't eaten since breakfast, and that feels very long ago. And I am stuck here until Cass comes back. Fixing him with a grin, she nodded. I could eat. Chapter 14. The only open table was one close to the dice game, but Jude made it easy to ignore the commotion. What are you hungry for, pretty lady? What would you recommend? Hollie replied, unfamiliar with the menu or even what a realm full of witches and warlocks would eat. You can't go wrong with the French fries. They have French fries on sour thrace? She asked, surprised. He chuckled. French fries are multiversal. That's to say, they have a version of it on every world that's civilized enough to heat up oil to scalding temperature and toss a potato or a reasonable facsimile into it. French fries sound perfect. Hollie could feel herself starting to relax, grateful to be able to push away thoughts of the vampire, if only for a few moments. She watched as Jude summoned a waitress who appeared carrying 4 trays, one in each of her 4 hands. What can I get you? She asked, and Hollie noticed that her skin had a slight bluish tinge. The elaborate golden bangles around her neck contained little ivory beads in the shape of miniature human skulls. French fries, please, Jude announced. And ketchup. Am I saying that right? He asked Hollie. Ketchup, she corrected with a grin.
No idea what ketchup is, but we don't have any, the waitress said in a bored tone. Just the fries is fine, Hollie told her, and the waitress set off to retrieve their order. Turning back to Jude, she took advantage of the opportunity to study him. There was a jovial quality to him, a mischievousness that reminded her of the class clown at her high school. But that guy was nowhere near as handsome as the warlock is. He grinned at her, his eyes like liquid gold. Why did you come back unexpectedly? He asked, maintaining eye contact. It's sort of a long story. An excuse seemed better than explaining her travail. Let's keep things light, since they're bound to be temporary. And I'm a short attention span sort of a guy, he asked, as if he'd somehow landed on her wavelength. He shrugged. Some guys want to get serious so fast, it can be a bit off-putting. You know what I mean. She did. The image of the vampire was in her mind before he finished his sentence. You don't have to worry about all that with me, he assured her. I can never stay put for very long, certainly not long enough for a long-term commitment. Eternity isn't in my vocabulary. His words surprised her, and not just because they hit home. We seemed strangely in sync, she thought, remembering their conversation in the shop and how he'd seemed to know things about her already. Maybe he's using magic on me, she thought, remembering Kaz's little dust trick. From one manipulator to another, I need to reevaluate my taste in men. The fries arrived, and not a moment too soon. Hollie was feeling suddenly ravenous, and she dug into the golden fried potatoes with relish. I like a woman who enjoys her food, Jude said idly. It usually means they're passionate about other things as well. Hollie hid her blush. I think food could be my all-consuming passion, she said with a laugh. Jude put a hand over her heart, making a wounded expression. You really know how to break a guy's confidence, he said, then grinned. I don't think that's possible, she countered. You seem like you're all confidence. All bark and no bite, he said, then shook his head. Is that what you're saying? I have known dogs less talkative than you, she told him around fries. It was his turn to laugh. Well, unlike other species, I don't bite. The words hung between them, and Hollie couldn't help comparing him with the vampire. As definitely bites, she thought. Jude couldn't be more different from the vamp. Maz had seemed serious, brooding, unrelenting, even during their conversation at the nymph bar. His demeanor had an edge to it. Jude, on the other hand, was the opposite of serious. He was a prankster, but a harmless one. She just pushed the plate of fries away when a ruckus started at the table where the patrons were playing dice. Cheat! Rang out, followed by a round of curses. I'll slit your throat for that, someone croaked, and Hollie saw it was what appeared to be a man-sized bullfrog in fancy clothing. No one cheats me! Mr. Toad is about to go on a wild ride, Hollie thought, feeling a touch of hysteria. So much had happened in a short time, her brain was working overtime. Now, gentlemen, Jude said, trying to calm them down, it's true that no one likes a cheat, but I'm certain you can work things out without resorting to violence. The hairy gentleman next to Mr. Toad pulled out a long knife and growled, Violence is quicker and more effective. Hollie's muscles tightened in preparation for the impending melee. Here we go again. The bullfrog let out a croak and hopped off his chair, opening his vest to reveal a hand axe. You're going to give us every coin you took off us tonight and whatever else you have stashed in your coin purse. Like hell's I am. This came from a short, stocky man with scraggly hair and a bone-white hat drooping over his forehead. You come for my coin, and I'll suck my hat in your blood until it's dyed red. Mr. Toad and the hairy guy looked at each other, then burst out laughing. You redcaps always say that, the bullfrog replied, brandishing his axe. But it's your blood you should be worried about. Letting out a howl, the hairy man suddenly became hairier. A werewolf. That's just what this situation needs. Hollie reached into a pocket, a hand picking up the coin Cass had given her and holding it there, just in case of an emergency. That's enough of that! Phaedra elbowed her way into the group. Whatever petty squabble you're having, it's over. Take your business out into the street. This tavern is staying dry of blood while I'm here. The crowd around the table took in the warrior Fae with her shining gossamer wings and the sword strapped to her back. The wolfman snarled.
Somebody get the fairy out of here!
Fairy? Phaedra asked, heated. I guess that dust wore off, Hollie thought, wondering if the Fae would insist on fighting the entire bar now because of the insult. It seems like there's something everyone can agree on, Jude said, loud enough for the rowdy group to hear him. No one wants the fairy here. A shout of laughter went up from the crowd. Phaedra froze, her cheeks turning red. Fine, she said stiffly, crossing her arms. But if I catch one whiff of blood, I'm going to make you regret the day you learned how to count the pips on a die. Phaedra shoved her way through the crowd, retreating once more to the bar. Jude rose and took her place, acting as mediator. At first, anyway. Look, gentlemen, you can spend the evening swapping blows, or you can settle your differences and get back to the dice.
Are we supposed to forget he cheated?
The frogman croaked indignantly. How exactly did he cheat? Jude asked. Loaded dice.
They must be, the werewolf replied. He has hit us straight several times tonight. You know how difficult that is?
Jude nodded, scratching his chin. 3 rolls in 100 probability. Hollie's eyes widened, surprised. Is he some kind of math whiz? She soon learned that it wasn't his enthusiasm with mathematics that led to his knowing the probability of the roll. 5 of a kind is tougher, and the bigger pot, Jude pointed out. You've only got a 1 in 100 chance of rolling 5 of the same dice on one roll. He turned to the short, dwarf-like man. If you were going to cheat, why not cheat big?
Exactly,
the man in the cap said, crossing his arms over his chest.
This guy knows what he's talking about. Then let him roll with your dice, the bullfrog countered. If he rolls us straight, we'll have our answer.
Jude eyed the dice cup. Okay, gentlemen, I'm game. Picking up the cup, he shook it and then turned it over. Dice spilled from the cup. When they'd landed, Hollie saw that there were 4 5s and a single 1.
See, the little man yelled. The dice are not loaded.
Fine, the wolfman grumbled. But you're using another set for the rest of the night.
Too bad there was no money on that roll, Mr. Toad told Jude. You'd be sitting on a small pile of gold for those dice.
Well, I suppose the next one could be for coin, Jude said, a grin appearing on his face. What say you? Shall we resume the game? I've got a few coins that I'm willing to risk. Hollie rested her chin on her hand. So much for having dinner together, she thought, watching the gusto with which Jude joined the game. Looks like he's no stranger to games of chance. There you are! Hollie turned her head to see the witch rushing toward her. Her expression was harried. I'm afraid I have some bad news to share. She took the seat recently vacated by Jude. The High Council of Witches has considered your matter, and the consensus is that we can no longer help you. What? This came from Phaedra, who was over by the bar with Taylor. Pointed ears twitching, she stormed in their direction. Damned Fae hearing, Cass grumbled. I'm very sorry, Hollie, but I cannot go against the council, and they've forbidden me from trying the spell again. The interference during the ritual, followed by the zombie attack, has them rattled. Me too. So the witches are all quaking in their pointed boots, are they? Phaedra said, having reached their table. She put her knuckles on it and leaned forward menacingly. You're really going to turn your back on a poor human in trouble? It isn't my choice, Cass replied. Dark forces are afoot, and the council thinks that Hollie is a liability. How convenient. Phaedra straightened, hands on her hips. I knew this trip was worthless.
Why can't you attempt the spell again? Taylor asked, having followed her fellow Fae. The council is afraid of attracting the wrong attention. Cass stared down at the tabletop, her expression conflicted. One of the members consulted her runes concerning the event and came away with visions of calamity. Her voice deepened, her eyes taking on a faraway look. Darkness is on the horizon, and somehow you are tied up in it. We witches want nothing to do with the darkness. I'm sorry. Cowards, Faye shot out, her voice dripping with scorn. One measly vampire going after his mate is enough to frighten an entire realm of powerful magic users. You should be ashamed of yourselves. What's that you said? Cass asked, shock seeping into her features. Did you say mate? Her eyes shot to Hollie. Explain. The vampire pursuing me
He says I'm his mate. Oh, no, the witch said, standing up swiftly. No, 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 her face swelling with anger. She unleashed the torrent on them. You never told me she was the fiend's mate. No wonder the spell didn't work. Vampires and their mates are bound by blood. All bets are off when it comes to that kind of blood bond. Hollie closed her eyes, hopelessness sinking in. Even the witches can't help me? There really is no escape. Phaedra threw up her hands, and Taylor attempted to calm her, while Cass reached across the table to her. I'm sorry. I really am. I would not want to be in your position any more than you probably do, but my magic cannot help you against your mate. My mate? Could it really be true? I can take you wherever you want to go, the witch told her. The sooner the better, if the council has its way, and they usually do. Hanging her head, Hollie debated her options. If I go home, I'm a sitting duck. As opposed to a flying one, Cass said, confused. It's just an expression. I mean, the vampire will easily find me because he knows where I live, but I can't think of anywhere else to go. Come back to Valencia, Phaedra said, returning to the conversation. No vampire can cross our borders, and you'll have plenty of powerful Fae on your side.
Or you could return to the Fae Wilds, Taylor offered. I'm certain you would be welcome back.
Phaedra gave the other Fae a dirty look. Valencia would be a better choice. Who knows what trouble Elspeth and her people might get into?
Just because Elspeth left the realm due to a prophecy her brother lied about doesn't make her a troublemaker, Taylor replied tartly.
How about another option? Jude said, idly shaking dice in his cup. You would be a fool to trap yourself with these uptight, stuffy forest lovers. Mind your business, Phaedra growled. No one asked your opinion, did they? Jude ignored the Fae. You should take a page from my book. Keep traveling. He can't find you if you're always on the go. And the adventures you have will be much more exciting than anything that's going on in Valencia. If you'd like, I'd be happy to take you with me on my travels. Phaedra blew a raspberry at him, then shoved him back in the direction of the dice table. Weren't you busy doing something else? Jude laughed, but he did as she suggested, tossing his dice on the table and letting out a hoot of delight when 3 threes appeared. That's 5 coins from each of you. A chorus of groans echoed through the crowd. And once again he's forgotten me. Hollie sighed, but she did consider his offer. He could be right. If I stay on the run, I can't be caught. Jude let up another cheer, and Hollie wished she had something to cheer about. Chapter 15. Just when things were getting good between us, she booted me from her dream. Maz was back on Pluto, checking for any word on the missing imp and attempting to gauge his master's mood from his underlings. Rumor had it that Samael was on a tear, shredding anyone who crossed his path. Maz thanked the hobgoblin for his report of Samael's latest tirade, wondering what had happened to upset him so badly. The Angel of Death's feathers didn't ruffle easily, and when Dallin had escaped previously, it hadn't provoked as much rage. What's different this time? It didn't matter, Maz figured. He was supposed to be finding the imp, and that meant he had a free pass to stay gone from Pluto to search. A free pass he meant to use, but right now finding Dallin was the last thing he was concerned about. The way he'd been ejected from his mate's dream still bothered him. She must have woken up, he told himself. But why? What had ripped her to consciousness like that? He replayed the situation in his mind. Maz had asked her for a memento to remember her by, foolishly forgetting that they were in her dream. She just leaned in, a teasing smile on her face, about to say something, and poof! I wonder what she was about to say to me. Not knowing was driving him crazy. And it wasn't exactly poof. It was more like Hollie had flickered twice, then faded, like an after-image of light remaining in your field of vision after looking away. When have I experienced that before? Maz racked his brain, a wriggle of familiarity bothering him. Normally when someone woke up from their dream, they disappeared, there one instant and not the next. There had been no flickering, no fading. Magic. It had to be. His brow furrowed.
Hollie had been running around with a contingent of Fae. Could one of them have caused that effect? Maz had walked the web for many millennia. He was familiar with the lore of 100 or more species. Fae were blessed with powerful magic, but not all of them could dreamwalk. In fact, it was a rare ability. Maybe they weren't in the world of dreams. Maybe the interference came from outside. But even that didn't make sense. If the Fae didn't know she was dreaming, then how could they have pulled her out like that? The witch, of course. He'd found her in a shop, reeking of magic, and been banished from the realm by a dark-haired woman sitting behind a desk. The thought appeared in his mind suddenly, making him scowl. There were multitudes of magical races in the multiverse, but few races dealt in magic for money. Witches and warlocks, on the other hand, had developed intricate, delicate, and potent spells and incantations. Their magic could have caused an effect like that. The vampire quickly put together what might have happened. My mate wanted to keep me away, and the Fae were unable to provide the kind of spell she needed to do so. So they went to the witches and attempted to somehow build a magical wall to keep me out. But something went wrong. His instinct told him he was on the right track. Still, there were many witches and warlocks in the web. Samothrace is their headquarters. It would make sense to start there. In an instant, he was standing in the murky forest said to be ruled by the Rotten Queen. He's never seen Hecate himself, but he'd heard enough stories to be thankful that he hadn't. The gloom of the forest protected him from the harshest of the sun's rays as he picked his way through the trees to the path he knew led into the realm's bustling capital city. This wasn't his first time in Samothrace. Although he tried not to make a habit of coming here, Samael had directed him here on his dark errands several times, but no matter how many times he came to the land of the witches in his long lifetime, he never failed to feel unsettled. Maybe it was the witch's abilities that worried him. Maz was powerful, that was undeniable, but he couldn't fathom the intricate and formidable magic that could do almost anything. Summonings, traveling from realm to realm, transformations, hallucinations raising the dead, and that barely scratched the surface of their myriad capabilities. Although the sun was on its way to setting, Maz had to wait until it set entirely before making his way into the capital. For that reason, he traveled to the forest to lurk, to attempt to plan, to strategize how best to control himself if he was fortunate enough to come across his mate. His steps were slow and circular, killing time until sunset. Maz was just stepping over a small stream with water black like ichor when a familiar odor hit his nose. He froze, then jolted forward until he got enough of a grip on himself to force himself to stop. "My mate is here!" His instincts going haywire, it took him a long moment of steady breaths to get himself fully under control. When he was as calm as he could get, Maz stepped forward, following the trail of her scent. It wasn't long before another smell joined hers, and it was nowhere near as delectable. The stench of undead destroyed the veneer of calm he'd managed, releasing a torrent of emotion. Fear and anger rose to the top, propelling him forward with supernatural speed. Seconds later, he came upon a scene of carnage. Rotting corpses littered the path and the woods around it. The zombies had more than met their match, it appeared, their bodies ravaged, many missing their heads entirely. Relief flooded him. The Fae were up to the challenge, it appeared, which meant his mate was more than likely safe. He caught a whiff of Hollie's scent trailing off into the woods bordering the path. His relief faded and he charged forward, following the smell off the path. His fear doubled back, knotting his insides. Will I find her body torn apart as part of the zombies' feast, or worse? Will I find my mate has become one of them? The thought chilled him to the bone. At last he found a clearing the bodies of 2 more undead, both dispatched by violent means. There was no sign of Hollie. Although her scent was all over the 2 dead zombies, although his anxiety didn't entirely abate, he did find a measure of relief. It seemed her Fae protectors had kept her from being a zombie's dinner. Maz returned to the path, tracking his mate's smell, until he could see a break in the path before him. The trees receded from an opening lined with stone which had been wrapped with roots and vines. likely by magical means. Beyond the doorway, he could see buildings and a brick roadway. He'd reached the capital just before sunset. Waiting those remaining minutes to enter the town was hell on the vampire. His body was tense, his need to be near his mate eating at him, trying to propel him into the fading last rays of the day despite the danger. Finally, he could take it no longer. Although a sliver of sun remained above the horizon, Maz stepped through the doorway and into the shadow between two buildings. Although he'd never walked the streets of Samothrace during the daylight hours, he couldn't imagine a crush any greater than this one. Beyond the usual shops, inns, and restaurants that drew off-worlders from near and far, after the sunset, the streets of Samothrace became a sprawling night market, one of the largest in the web. He crept to its edges, keeping to the shadows where the lingering light couldn't affect him. In the shadows, his vampiric form allowed him to blend seamlessly with the darkness. In this way, he could surveil the scene before revealing himself. He waited, watching the sliver of sun until it disappeared from sight. Now! Maz glided forward, doing nothing to disguise himself. Gasps and moans rose up around him as he hurried through the densely packed crowd. He whizzed after the scent, out of the alley and across the crowded thoroughfare. Moments later, he stood outside the bubbling brew. "She's in there." Without hesitation, he moved to open the door, then froze. Taking a step back, he inhaled, bristling at the odor of imp. "Dallin," he growled, his nails automatically lengthening to black claws. He balled his hands into fists, and the nails dug into him. The pain allowed him to clear his head enough not to rush directly in. "That black-hearted imp is here for one reason and one reason only. He wants Hollie." Maz couldn't forget the imp's plan to kidnap his mate and trade her to Ahriman to be used as a pawn against Samael. He failed at his first attempt, but it appears he ascribed to the mantra of try again. But this time, there will be no next time. His rage ripped at him, tearing away his restraint. Maz pulled the door open and stepped inside, scanning the crowd. The two Fae stood out instantly, their wings drawing his attention first. Then his gaze shifted to the bright-haired beauty sitting at the table beside them, across from the woman who'd banished him from her shop. His insides lit up with the fire of 1,000 dawns. "My mate!" Everything inside him screamed to go to her, to touch her, to talk to her, to claim her as his own. Resisting that urge was the hardest thing Maz had ever done, harder even than the torture Samael had subjected him to for much of his short, brutal childhood. Barely, just barely, he was able to look past her. Over her shoulder, Maz took in a group gathered around a large table, the sound of shaking dice and clinking coins telling him that a game was in progress. The imp was a degenerate gambler, so it figured he'd be at the center of a game of chance. "Pony up, gentlemen!" his voice rang out over the raucous crowd. "I'm about to take all the coin in your pockets!" Dallin looked to be in rare form, his grin unbridled, drunk on the feverish energy he got from risking a great win or a terrible loss. He's about to learn the true meaning of terrible loss. It was the last thought his rational mind had, seeing Dallin in the flesh. The imp would not be allowed to carry out his plan of abducting his mate. His overprotectiveness in overdrive, he rushed to the table, ready to prove to the imp once and for all that Hollie belonged to him and him alone. Chapter 16. The witch was mid-sentence when she straightened, her dark hair suddenly bristling with electricity. "He's here!" Hollie didn't have to ask her which he she meant. Fright shook her, but she had no time to react to the warning. She felt a whoosh of wind blow her hair back a split second before the screams. Whirling around in her chair, she took in the scene directly behind her. It was chaos. The vampire was there, dressed in a long black cloak, his hair without a strand out of place. His eyes a red so intense it turned her insides to ice. His hand was wrapped around Jude's throat, holding the warlock aloft. He looked to be a second away from ripping the warlock's head off. Hollie hadn't even had the time to stand when Phaedra shot like a bullet past her, her hands blazing with a bright glow. "I'll try to shield you," Taylor shouted at the same moment, and Hollie turned back to see the witch, who had her wand out and was circling it, enlarging a whirling black vortex. A glass bubble appeared around them a moment later, emanating from the Fae. It caught the edge of the witch's expanding vortex and buckled. Hollie watched in horror as the two began to intertwine, braiding together and becoming a gray that whipped around, wrapping around Hollie's waist before shooting behind her. "Release the shield!" she heard Cass shout to Taylor. A moment before, an explosion sounded from behind her. Hollie was knocked out of her chair by the blast of energy, but instead of hitting the floor, she discovered there was no floor. Sucked into a pit of blackness, the world around her lost all definition. The void didn't last for long, however, because she suddenly found herself encircled by silver walls. The reflective dome above her showed her that she was in a round room, half of a sphere, laden with sumptuous carpets. Candles burned on almost every surface, filling the space with a warm glow. "Where am I?" A harsh curse in a language she didn't understand caught her attention. She turned, already knowing who the voice belonged to. His back was to her. Her movement attracted his notice. He whirled around, on defense, then stiffened when he saw her. They stared at each other. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, her pulse jumping. "I've got to get out of here," her brain insisted, but there was no out to be found. The round dome of a room offered no means of entry or exit. Panic drenched her, and she watched him, waiting for the moment that he grabbed her and sank his fangs into her neck. The vampire watched her silently for a moment, then moved to the right, taking a seat in an expansive-looking wingback chair. He sat there calmly, unmoving. For the long moments it took her to get her fear under control. Hollie didn't know how to respond. The last time she'd seen him had been in her dream. After chasing her, he'd invited her to drinks and explained that it hadn't been him chasing her. It was her nightmare version of him. The real version of himself that he'd presented to her at the Dryad Bar had been polite, sophisticated, and seemed to have a sort of strange charm she'd found attractive. And then he sent a horde of zombies to kidnap me? Maz showing up in the tavern on Summer Thrace only heightened the likelihood that he'd been behind their ambush in the forest. And now I'm trapped here with him, wherever here is. "Hollie," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time she'd heard her name on his lips, and its faintly husky quality sent a tingle through her. "Get your head on straight," she told herself, "or you're about to end up a vampire's dinner." She held up a finger, cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. The fact that he wasn't rushing to attack her unnerved her more than anything. Hollie let her rage take hold. "Why did you bring me here?" "I didn't," he replied simply. She scoffed, bristling like an angry cat. "You expect me to believe that, just like you probably didn't send the zombies, right?" "Right," he said with a nod. "Why are you doing this to me? Why do you keep playing with me? How am I supposed to believe anything you say?" She felt on the verge of a breakdown. Hands shaking, she waited for him to respond. "This time, I've had nothing to do with our appearance in this realm. Look to your friends and their magic if you want to assign blame." His tone was matter-of-fact, but not offensive. It did little to make her feel better. "Fine. If you won't admit the truth, at least do me the courtesy of telling me where we've ended up." The vampire scanned the space. "I'm afraid I don't know the answer to your query. One moment we were in the tavern on Samothrace, the next we were here. Like you, I was given no map or directions." "Sarcasm is a bold move, especially from you," she griped. Oddly, their banter, or what passed for it, was helping her nerves to subside. She took a seat on a delicate settee. Primly crossing her legs, she decided to give as good as she had gotten. "So you're telling me that a powerful being like you was caught off guard?" He shrugged, not reacting to her mocking tone. "Magic is inherently unstable." Hollie let out a long breath. What is this conversation? The vampire kept her on her back foot. He never seemed to do what she expected. Well, except for one thing. He won't quit coming for me. "So we are stuck here, in some random room with no exits and no clue as to where we are." A prison with mirror walls, less than 500 square feet if she had to judge. And a vampire I trust less than an influencer's paid review. "It must be a pocket dimension," he told her. "An extremely small one. Who it belongs to, I could not fathom to guess. Mayhaps a wealthy merchant who wants a place to stash his wealth, or his mistress,
a royal with a need for privacy, a secretive politician with a place to arrange clandestine meetings. Whoever it is, they have both coin and an understated sense of luxury. Or maybe an ancient vampire with a flair for the dramatic who needs a place to play with his victims' minds before draining them. Hollie couldn't keep the tautness out of her voice. I'm tired of being pushed around so much for my usual ditzy persona. I'm using Phaedra as my mentor now, and she's not afraid to call it like she sees it. Perhaps if you're hinting that it's me, you would be mistaken. My pocket dimension is much more substantial. The note of pride in his voice made him sound sincere. And if you will allow me another correction, we are not stuck here. I can travel anywhere, anytime I choose.
Then why haven't you?
It would be rude, he said, adjusting the lapel of his black jacket.
That so, Professor?
The superiority radiating from the vampire was irking the heck out of her.
Well, don't hang around on my account. As far as I'm concerned, we can say our farewells.
He stared at her for a moment, a faint wrinkle of displeasure in his forehead.
Unless you'd like me to take you somewhere, we could go together. Fat chance, she said with a roll of her eyes.
I am aware of your distrust, Maz told her, straightening his sleeves while he did so. She didn't miss the thread of irritation that was running through his words.
But I had hoped our last interaction would put you at ease. You're talking about that little nightmare into dream date scenario you cooked up?
Her disdain for his antics was on full display.
I have no idea what you thought that would get you.
She shook her head.
I still don't understand your endgame. To build rapport, to gain your trust.
His features were neutral, but there was an undercurrent of urgency to his words.
To prove to you that I am worthy of you.
Burying her face in her hands, Hollie was filled with incredulity.
You can't be serious. You've done nothing but give me reasons to distrust you. There's no coming back from that.
He stiffened.
You are mistaken. You haven't given me the opportunity to show you the man that I am. You're not a man, she said, giving him both barrels. You're a leech.
His lip twitched, revealing a pearly fang. That is unfair, especially from you. The hurt she caused him pricked her, but she told herself she was being foolish. No tears for a creature that survives on the blood of others. He's a parasite, and he's gaslighting you.
Why especially me? I imagine all of your victims feel that way about you.
You are not a victim, he said, his earlier restraint straining.
You are my mate.
Just stop, Hollie held up her hand, weary of the never-ending back and forth.
You're behaving as if I owe you something. I don't owe you anything. You've been nothing but cruel and demanding. And this matehood you're always screaming about, it's a two-way street, isn't it? What if I never accept that I'm your mate? Because I've got to tell you, buddy, there's a really high chance of that outcome.
His face turned black.
A vampire has only one mate for all eternity. If his mate dies, he is never given another, no matter how long he might live. The pain from that would be close to unbearable. But to be rejected by your eternal mate, the agony of that is unfathomable. Don't go all emo on me, vamp.
Hollie could hear the truth in his words, even though she didn't want to. Why is everything always so difficult, so heavy? I want to go back to the way things were when life was simple and I'd never met a vampire, fae, or demon. She closed her eyes, telling herself that she had to work things out one at a time. First, I've got to get out of here, and there is one thing I haven't tried. Springing up, she picked up a heavy wooden chair, straining to lift it, then swung it at an empty expanse of mirrored walls. The wall cracked, and hope lifted her while she watched it climb toward the dome. About halfway up it stopped, and to her horror, the cracks started to seal themselves, working their way back down to her. By the time they reached the place where the chair had struck, every crack was healed. It looked just like it had before. She stared at her dead-eyed reflection and knew it was time to swallow her pride. Dropping the chair and leaving it to clatter on the floor, she turned back to the vampire.
Take me back to Earth.
She slouched, defeat weighing her down. The vampire looked at her for a moment before he stood and held a hand out to her. His expression said he wasn't certain she would grasp it. For good reason, Hollie thought, looking at the elegantly sculpted hand. The nails are tipped in black, she noticed, a ripple of fear spreading through her. What choice have you got? It's not like you have a lot of options. Willing her hand not to shake, she placed it in the vampire's. His skin was cool to the touch, but otherwise not unpleasant. Maz held her hand gingerly, as if he were afraid she would retract it at any moment. I will return you to your home, he told her, then squeezed her hand tighter. Here we go. Hollie closed her eyes and waited for the whoosh that always sent her stomach for a loop when she moved between realms. But this time nothing happened. Opening her eyes, she saw a look of shock on the vampire's face. What's wrong? She asked, afraid she already knew the answer. I can't travel, he said, his voice a mixture of anxiety and anger. It seems we are stuck here. Hollie held back on the I told you so because the expression on his face prompted a wave of sympathy for him, as much as she didn't want it to. Just when I think it can't get any worse. Chapter 17. The vampire had a wild look in his eye, and before her hand started to tremble, she carefully extracted it from his larger one. He kept staring at her, her gaze seeming to reach inside her, to puncture her psychically. It was difficult to tear her eyes away, but she did, taking several steps away from him. He's starting to crack, she thought, biting her lip. How much longer until he decides he's done with whatever this is and sinks his fangs into me? Hollie was pretty certain that the vampire wasn't lying about his lack of ability to leave. If he is, he's the best damn actor I've ever seen. He'd have a line of little golden statues on the mantle of the cave. Do vampires live in caves? Her thoughts were cut off when Maz let out a sound of frustration. I take it this is unusual for you, she asked him, keeping any hint of sarcasm out of her tone. Still, he looked at her skeptically. You could say that. Something is interfering with your powers. Obviously. He took a breath, checking himself. My apologies. I have not confronted an issue with my abilities since I was freshly turned. What has happened now I would have deemed impossible if I were not living through it. He ran his hands over his hair, then started to pace, reminding Hollie of a caged animal. There must be a way out of here. The vamp clearly did not like being trapped. She watched him pace, his motions getting more and more erratic until he swooped down to pick up the toppled chair and gripped it in his hand, which was now displaying inch-long black claws in place of his fingernails. Maz swung it with incredible force at the wall in the same spot she had. Cracks exploded from the impact, much faster and more plentiful than the ones she'd made with her own blow. They reached the top of the dome, and Hollie covered her head to protect it from the mirror glass that was sure to rain down on them at any moment. But it never did. The vampire howled, following it up with a string of curses. He swung the chair again, over and over, harder and harder, until every square inch of the mirrored room was cracked, but once again they healed as rapidly as he had made them. Hollie lost track of how long he went at the walls, but the end result was the same as her own, despite his supernatural strength and speed. He stood there, heaving with anger, apparently debating whether to redouble his attacks, but she'd had enough. Bored with failure, she decided it was time to take a look around. Their bubble was small compared to a full-sized dwelling with multiple rooms, but it was still sizable enough to contain an appropriate amount of furnishings. Beyond their chairs and the one they'd battered against the walls, there was a neat desk and chair, a tall case filled with a multitude of tiny drawers, and a wash basin on a stand. There were paintings on easels, bookshelves stuffed with books and knickknacks, end tables with statuary, and, of course, the candles, which Hollie noticed never seemed to burn down. Their wicks were exactly as long as they'd been when the two of them had arrived. She approached an intimate dining table with an elaborate floral arrangement at its center. Besides the place settings, there were several serving dishes of sterling silver, each one covered. Assuming they were empty underneath, Hollie lifted the lid on one and was surprised to find a steaming meat pie. Touching it with a finger, she flinched at the burn. She stuck the finger in her mouth and returned the cover to its place, then uncovered another to find roasted vegetables. One cover after another she lifted until a full meal and dessert was laid out before her. Should I? Why the heck not? Answered herself out loud.
then sat in one of the dining chairs, lifting the carefully folded dinner napkin from her empty place and putting it on her lap. When she looked up, she realized what had been an empty wine glass a moment before was now full of a light golden liquid. If this food is any good, I could easily get used to this treatment. Dinner on demand, always hot and ready. Wasting no time, she sliced into the meat pie, her mouth starting to water as its savory aroma hit her. She lifted a fork to her mouth and slid it inside, letting out a hum of delight the moment the food hit her tongue. "It's phenomenal. You really should try this," she said between bites. "It's magnificent." Maz's back was to her, his attention on the mirror wall. He wasn't ready to give up on his escape attempt, it seemed. She watched him flick out his wrists, his claws lengthening until they were twice as long. The vampire drove them into the mirror wall, his arm going through it to the elbow. Cracks danced out from the hole, but soon reversed, the wall once again healing itself, but this time around the vamp's limb. She saw him grimace when the wall started to heal into him, the mirror attempting to mend itself through his flesh. With great effort, he pulled his arm back out of the wall, freeing himself, but paying a price for it. His skin was laced with deep furrows where the glass had pierced him. Hollie dropped her fork, concerned, but before she could even think about helping him, the vampire's scratches began to heal. Faster than even the cracks on the wall, his flesh was once again smooth and unblemished. Maz growled in frustration. The anger that had been simmering below the surface was now on full display. Despite the deliciousness of the food, her appetite had fled. "I'm trapped with a vampire who is about to hit the ceiling on his rage, and when he does, what's going to happen to me then? I've got to calm him down, distract him, get him to start thinking rationally again, and maybe I'll survive long enough to get the heck out of here and away from him." "Why don't you take a break?" she said cheerfully, hoping to divert his attention. "This food is fantastic. You should really join me." She forced herself to swallow a glazed carrot and moan in delight. Okay, maybe the moan wasn't a hardship. This food really is that good. Maz turned to face her, and Hollie saw that his eyes had turned red. "You shouldn't invite a vampire to dinner and expect to still draw breath afterwards," he snapped. Inside, she recoiled in horror, but somehow Hollie managed to keep a grip on her emotions. Her expression was impassive, and she shrugged her shoulder as if she didn't care. "Suit yourself, but don't be annoyed when I eat every bite of this dessert. It's got fresh whipped cream." Maz watched her, doubt on his face. He might not believe her false cheer, but at least he wasn't trying to rip down the walls barehanded anymore. "Looks like I'm going to have to dig deep and be a better actor than his vampiric majesty," she told herself. Sliding her fork into the sugary concoction covered in sweet cream and a drizzle of something that could be caramel, she lifted it to her lips. The first bite was rapture, and the moan she let out this time wasn't faked. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat, savoring the light and fluffy sweet. Bite after bite, she devoured it, letting out little noises of satisfaction as she went. When she finally dropped her fork and looked up, she saw the vampire standing across the table from her, his hands gripping the back of a chair tightly enough to whiten his knuckles. "I ate it all," she said with a little giggle, then covered her mouth. "I'm sorry you didn't get a taste." "There is a bit of cream on your lip," he said, his gaze focused in that area. "Right there," he said, leaning in to touch her gently. She barely felt it when he swiped the cream off her skin. Holding it up, he looked at it for a moment, then poked the finger into his own mouth. His eyes flashed red to blue, then back again before finally settling into blue. Without a word, he pulled out the chair and sat, folding his hands and looking at her. "Would you like to try something?" she asked, indicating the remaining food. "Trust me, it's all top-notch." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I haven't eaten solid food in millennia, and I'm afraid my body couldn't digest it, even if I were to eat it." "Millennia?" she said, her mouth falling open. "Did you say millennia?" When he nodded, she followed up with a second question. "How many millennia?" He looked up at the ceiling, his expression saying he was counting. "When you're my age, the years begin to blend together, but if I were to hazard a guess, I'd say at least 4. 4? He's 4,000 years old.
Hollie couldn't even begin to comprehend what a life that long would be like. 4,000 years ago, that's like biblical times. Visions of ancient Egypt and the Parthenon in Greece flitted through her mind. "The things you must have seen," she said softly, wondering what she might be like if she was still around 4,000 years from now. Probably nothing. Not even a heap of bones lasts that long. He looked at her, his gaze traveling once again to her lips, which was slightly parted with breathlessness in the wake of his revelation. Hollie rushed to keep speaking, to break the awkward tension she could feel building between him. "He's so striking. If he weren't busy hunting humans, he could be walking the runway in Paris or Milan. Women would flock to him." She gave her head a quick shake to drive out the direction of her thoughts. "In all your years, have you ever ended up somewhere like this before?" "Certainly not," he said, but his eyes hinted that something haunted him, something he wasn't willing to share. "Have you at least heard of these pocket dimensions, right?" At his nod, she continued, "Have you ever heard of one designed to keep people locked away?" "There have been rumors of tiny realms like these, and they've been given various names, like pitcher plants." At her puzzled expression, he explained, "Certain carnivorous plants create their own pit traps. Nectar attracts insects, and when they reach the slippery rim of the plant, they fall inside, where digestive juices go to work, feeding on the prey that was foolish enough to go after the pitcher plant's nectar." Hollie shivered. "Plants aren't supposed to eat things, are they? Isn't it usually the other way around? Life feeds life, no matter the variety. Remember that." His expression was neutral, but his words carried an undeniable intensity. Putting aside the warning, Hollie continued probing. "If you've heard of these traps before, then you must know the means used to keep us here." "Various means come to mind, magic being the most obvious," Maz answered. "And like any prison, in order to get out, we need to find the key." "Key? Like an actual physical key?" Her eyes started scanning the room, looking for any signs of something that might unlock the doors of their cell. If there are any doors. It could be an actual key, or it could be some sort of code, some password, or other means of triggering the release mechanism. Maz scowled, his anger spiking up again. "But without knowing what hex or incantation is trapping us here, it's impossible to know what might serve as the key, or if there even is one." "Oh no, emo vampire is back. I better figure out some way to distract him before things go sideways." Hollie's gaze flicked to his lips as if her eyes had a mind of their own. "Oh no, we aren't going there," she told herself. She'd have to come up with some distraction soon, or she didn't want to think about what might happen. Life feeds on life. Chapter 18. "A key," she muttered. "A code or password or—" She remembered the time she'd gone to visit a high school friend who was going to school in Milwaukee. They decided to visit an escape room in a strip mall and had spent an hour failing to solve the locked room mystery and free themselves. "It's like I'm back in the stupid escape room again," she muttered to herself. "Escape room?" the vampire asked, his eyebrow cocking in interest. "It's something we do on Earth, a form of entertainment. You pay to go into a space that has been set up like a giant puzzle. They lock you inside, and you have to search for clues to solve the mystery and unlock the door." His loud chuckle surprised her. "You humans never cease to amaze me. You actually pay money to lock yourselves in a room for amusement?" Standing, Hollie ignored his poking fun at her species. "Well, any idea is better than no idea. If this is like an escape room, then we can find clues to help us escape. So I suggest you do less laughing and more searching." Hollie headed straight to the case with the dozens of little drawers. She'd been tempted to open one of its drawers earlier, but now her curiosity had a focus. She started with a drawer in the center of the case. Grasping the small, shiny knob, she tugged the drawer open. Inside was a lock of fine hair held together by a ribbon. Carefully, she pulled it out and held it up to the light. "It looks like baby hair," she said, then felt intrusive. She dropped the lock back into the drawer and pushed it closed. The one next to it was even creepier, containing 3 tiny teeth. I'm kind of scared to open another one, she admitted. If I find a tiny skull in here, I'm going to lose it. Maz joined her at the case, appearing by her side in the blink of an eye. She started, then settled herself. I've got to get used to how fast he is. The vampire chose a drawer of his own. He reached in to lift out a delicate piece of parchment. Hollie leaned in to see what was written on the paper and was surprised to see that it wasn't writing but a careful line drawing of a pair of boys. They were close enough to identical that she couldn't notice any differences between them. "Is this a clue?" she asked, wondering how they could disambiguate things that could be clues with things that were just unintentional objects. Hollie thought back to the escape room. She and her friend had been helpless at the task at hand, devolving into giggles when they realized they were outmatched. What did that escape room technician tell us? She mused out loud. Something about keeping things organized. Lay out all the clues in the same place and make a discard pile for the other. Glancing at the parchment in Maz's hand, she realized she still had no way of knowing whether it was relevant. He also suggested we divide and conquer, so I'm going to leave you to search this case, and I'll find something else to search. Hollie set her sights on a pair of easels near the cold fireplace. She walked toward them, examining each for anything that could be a clue. The first painting reminded her of the work of M.C. Escher. It was of a building, a temple of some sort if she had to guess, but the architecture, the geometry itself was wrong. Angles veered off each other, creating strange combinations that would be impossible to traverse. Not only could a humanoid not walk the bent stairs and circling spires, but the shapes themselves shouldn't be able to exist. For example, one of the towers was thicker at its tip than the base of the entire edifice. It should be tilting over, crushing into rubble, but instead it stands proud and impossible. Hollie gave up trying to assign any meaning to the painting and moved to the next. This easel held a vertical painting, this one of a group of crows taking flight. Their wings spread, they were soaring upwards toward a thick yellow moon. In the distance, scraggling, stark white trees created an eerie backdrop for their ascent. "Look at this!" She turned to find Maz behind her, holding up a bird's skull. "This may be relevant." Hollie looked from the skull to the painting and back again. "You think that's a crow's skull?" "No, a raven's. Crows' beaks have less of a curve." Hollie cocked her head to the side. "So ravens and crows aren't the same thing?" She'd always assumed the bird had two names, since she'd never seen a difference between them. "They are not. They have distinct cries and different shapes for their tail feathers," he indicated the painting. "You see here, a raven has a wedge-shaped tail, while a crow's is shaped like a fan." "If you say so, Professor," she said, but in actuality, Hollie was impressed. I suppose having 400 centuries to pick things up, he's likely hiding a wealth of knowledge behind that handsome face. "So, we've got a painting of ravens and a raven's skull. Those sure sound related." Hollie gingerly took the skull from him and balanced it atop the thick canvas. "What else can we find?" They spent the next hour digging through drawers, poking into intricate boxes and studying the art littering the room. Hollie opened books, frustrated to find that they were filled with symbols she couldn't decipher. Maz, on the other hand, knew several of the languages. "That one has the mark for raven in Old Croatic." Hollie dutifully put it in the pile, then looked for other signs of the symbol. It appeared in a scroll and in a painting that seemed like modern art swirls and blobs, but she found the symbol hidden among their paint strokes. Every time she found an object that had some bearing on a raven, she placed it on a table near the raven painting and skull. By the time she was starting to tire, they'd amassed a pile of raven-related items. "Do you really think these are all clues?" she asked, torn. Hollie wanted to believe they were making progress, but in reality, they'd likely only touched the surface of the mystery. There were so many other things to search, to categorize. "I can't say. They are definitely all ravens, and since there are so many, I would like to believe the raven is significant, but it is too early to say how. We should keep looking." Maz took charge, suggesting searching the room quadrant by quadrant as a team. "We are smarter together." She wasn't certain if the vampire intended the comment as a compliment, but it caused warmth to kindle inside her. I'm pretty sure you're the smart one, Professor, she said, falling into her old habit of pretending to be a know-nothing. Hollie had always figured folks liked a person who wasn't too smart, who wasn't a threat. The vampire, however, gave her a look that said he didn't appreciate her denigrating herself. You were the one who thought up the escape room approach, he said, wagging his finger in her direction. Don't sell yourself short. Her cheeks turned pink. Hollie looked away when she saw the burst of heat flame into life in his eyes. She followed his instructions, and they carefully made a circuit of the room. By the time they reached the spot where they'd started, she was certain several hours had passed. Their pile had grown siblings. Not only did they find a multitude of raven-related items, but they also found several objects related to children and more than a dozen images of twin boys. Hollie couldn't tell if they were the same twins that were drawn on this parchment, but she figured that it couldn't be pure coincidence. So we've got babies, ravens, and twins. Letting out a breath, she considered their clues, pushing her brain to jump hurdles despite her growing fatigue. After a moment of silence, she groaned. I don't see how any of these clues get us any closer to an exit. This has all been a wild goose chase. Did you know that the expression wild goose chase doesn't pertain to geese at all, but to horses? She looked up at him, frowning. Sorry, Professor, but your fun fact doesn't make me feel any better. This has all been a fruitless search, a waste of time. We're just as trapped as when we started. But we tried, he pointed out, and you don't seem the type to give up easily. Just look at the chase you led me on. It was a wild goose one if there ever was one. Her lips quirked up at his joke. A vampire with a sense of humor. What in the world's wide web will they think of next? Maz chuckled at her retort, and Hollie realized that much of the tension she'd felt earlier had melted away. There was a camaraderie between them now, one that was still coming into being. For good or ill, I'm starting to like the leech. Not wanting to face that thought, Hollie threw herself back down on the divan. I appreciate your recognizing my besting you by escaping your insane stalking, but I'm afraid I can't escape this. Maz took a seat on the rolled arm of the divan and stared down at her. You've been very resourceful, he said softly, especially given the fact that you're human. I'm beginning to dread your especiallys, she told him. I know we humans are probably akin to dumb ants or rodents to you, and compared to the other races in the web, we might not be so well equipped with magic or superpowers, but that doesn't mean we're all witless. Is that so? He pursed his lips and gave her a look. Then why are you always trying to pretend that the inside of your well-shaped skull is empty? Beg your pardon? Hollie said, feeling suddenly bare. It's not polite to point out someone's self-defense mechanism unless you're a paid therapist. You pretend you aren't smart. Your tone of voice, your inane questions. I know you're much cleverer than you let on. Or maybe I'm just good at pretending to be smart by not being smart. The vampire laughed, and it sent a frizzle of electricity through her nerve endings. When he isn't scowling, he's almost good-looking enough to float to heaven without wings. Then his grin exposed his fangs, and she corrected herself. Except for the whole blood-drinking thing, which isn't exactly angelic behavior. I think we can both agree that you're more intelligent than you want people to realize. He studied her, his eyes peering into her in a way that would be uncomfortable if it wasn't for the hint of hunger she saw in them. I wonder, where does that need to hide your true self come from? Hollie's mind immediately conjured up the image of her father, and her smile slipped. She swallowed, immediately trying to disguise the connection she'd made in her mind, but Maz was too quick to have missed a change in expression. I think you have an idea of what's caused it, don't you? Does he really want me to open up to him? To a creature who's pursued me across multiple realms without regard for my desire, my safety, or my consent? Hollie couldn't understand why the truth was still on the tip of her tongue, given how badly things had gone between them. But they aren't bad now, she considered. In fact, this has been kind of pleasant. She was bonding with the vampire, although she might come to regret it. Should I really give him more ammunition to turn around and use against me? When she looked up and saw the heat in his eyes, it called to an answering heat inside her, one she was rapidly losing control of. Maybe you're not as smart as he thinks. Chapter 19. When I was in middle school, my mother died. The words came out regardless of how she felt about it. Once the torrent began, she couldn't shut it off. After she was gone, my father and I grew even closer. I'd always been Daddy's girl, you know. We were best friends, probably because we were a lot alike. Just the two of us, making our way together in a crazy world. Hollie remembered those times fondly, when she'd been not quite a girl, but not a woman yet either. We'd been in our own mirrored bubble of sorts, our grief reflecting off each other, with only our closeness to keep the pain at bay. But as I got older, I realized that one day things would change. I would grow up, move out of the house, go to college, start a life of my own. Maz was watching her, his body giving her all the clues that he was actively listening to her, but he didn't interrupt. She appreciated the space to tell her tale in her own time. The closer I got to those things, the harder it was to pull away. She remembered how her father would put on a brave face for the world, locking away his loss and greeting everyone with smiles and jokes. Looks like that's another thing we have in common. We only show the world what we think they want to see. He still missed her. Years later, I would find him weeping. I'd try to hug him, but he'd make an excuse. He'd been chopping onions. He had dust in his eye, allergies, anything to throw me off the trail of how badly he was still hurting. Hollie caught a swift change in the vampire's expression, one that he hid just as swiftly. Something I said must have resonated. She continued her tale. He never dated anyone else, never even looked at another woman. My mother was the only one for him, and once she was gone, he sort of gave up on love. He didn't give up, Maz countered softly. He did the opposite. He held on tightly to her ghost. Hollie could tell from the roughness in his voice that Maz was affected by her words. I don't know if that was the right choice to make. I sometimes think things would have been better if he'd found someone new, someone he could be happy with. Maybe there was no one he could be happy with besides your mother. She couldn't lift her gaze to meet him. I know what he's talking about, and I'm not quite ready to go there. Maz thought she was his eternal mate, and that meant she was the only one for him, like her mother had been for her father. But humans don't have eternal mates, do they? He hid his depression well, but there were enough signs that I could see it. So when it came time to go away to college, I stayed at home instead, going to work for my father at his business. She chuckled, choking up at the same time. He was elated that I wanted to go into the family business. I never told him that I didn't, but that I couldn't leave him in the state he was in. A drop hit her arm, and Hollie discovered that she was crying. Showing weakness in front of the vampire, being vulnerable in front of him, was extremely hard. I could be his prey, and here I am, basically exposing my jugular vein to his sharp fangs. Still, she went on, unable to stop now that she'd started. Lately, though, I'd been getting restless. I'd started looking at internships with insurance companies in Chicago and Milwaukee. I was going to talk to him about moving out, was working myself up to it, but I never got the chance. The dam broke, tears falling in earnest. He died suddenly, leaving me alone. Sniffling, she let out the things she'd never told anyone, the things she'd been hiding from herself. I guess I got what I wanted. My dad wasn't around anymore to hold me back from starting my life. Suddenly, the vampire was sitting beside her on the divan, a silk handkerchief held out to her. Hollie didn't flinch this time. Having started to adjust to his speed, she took the hanky from him and dabbed her wet face. Guilt and shame, the dark minions that hinder grief from coming to its intended resolution. His tone was soft, his expression gentle. Hollie thanked him for the handkerchief, wondering again if she had the wrong impression of the vampire. His compassion came as a surprise, but it didn't have the impact that it might have once had. She'd started getting to know him, and with knowing came trusting. I hope he's the real Maz, and that he isn't suddenly going to turn the tables on me again. She felt herself closing up. The idea of exposing her innermost secrets to a virtual stranger
Starting to feel uncomfortable, Maz seemed to sense her shift and held her gaze, letting out a deep breath of his own. I know how it must have felt to lose your mother at a young age. I also lost my mother, my entire family, my entire race, when I was just a child. The revelation hung in the air between them. How old were you? She asked quietly. I could not tell you. I had learned to walk, learned to speak, but I was too young to be flung out of the nest alone. Hollie watched his expression harden. I remember the day, but barely, when she turned me over to Samael. The angel of death has made certain I never forget. What happened? She couldn't imagine meeting someone called the angel of death when she was still a toddler. The vampire recited his story as if he'd memorized it by rote. Our village had been stricken by a sickness, something they called the Black Throat. Many died. The shaman of our people said the darkling required a sacrifice, something pure in exchange for ending the plague. I was that sacrifice. Hollie stared at him, eyes wide. You were a sacrifice? A child sacrifice? Maz bowed his head, his shoulders showing the slightest slump. Guilt and shame, she recalled him saying. Looks like he was speaking from experience. My mother did what she had to save everyone she loved, except me, hung in the air between them unsaid. Hollie wasn't a mother, but she wasn't devoid of maternal instincts. I'm not sure I could give away my child, even if it meant saving the entire world. Some sacrifices are too great. She lifted a hand and placed it on his shoulder, hoping the gesture brought him some comfort. If someone had told me yesterday that I would be trying to comfort the vampire who's been the bane of my existence for months, I would have suggested they check themselves in for a full mental evaluation. I'm sorry, she said, the words sounding lame. But what else do you say to someone whose mother abandoned them to the devil? Maz leaned into her touch as if attracted to the warmth radiating from her. I hope that her bargain paid off, he said, his expression numb. I wouldn't put it past Samael to double-cross her. Hollie shook her head, wondering what she would have done if she were in Maz's position. I don't think I'd be strong enough to survive, let alone thrive, which is what he's done of sorts. What was it like, your childhood after the bargain? I wouldn't call it a childhood. Samael isn't exactly the nurturing type. He rubbed his eyes, his words coming out sporadically in the way of memories of trauma. Pluto is a dark place, the land of night. Cold stone ruins and the stink of sulfur and agony, not fit for a child, especially one grieving the loss of the only life he'd ever known. She squeezed his shoulder, and he moved to put his hand atop hers. He tried on a smile, but it was a thin thing. The first few years were spent either alone in the dark or undergoing torture of various kinds, always at the hands of Samael's minions. He tortured you? What sort of sick, sadistic creep tortures a helpless child? The sympathy for him surged, and she could feel the wall she'd built against him starting to crumble. Samael said he needed to toughen me up, that I would never survive in his realm if I wasn't able to persevere through the pain. Maz stared off into the distance. I think he was trying to test me, to test my spirit more than my tolerance for hurt. The weak-willed never interest Samael. He told me once that ruling over the weak doesn't make you strong, but conquering the strong makes you a true master. This guy sounds like a Class A jerk, Hollie grumbled, and Maz burst out in surprised laughter. He is, he said, still chuckling. Some of his sorrow seemed to fade. But he is my master. He made me what I am. Is he the one who changed you, or were you always like you are now? It was an awkward question, but an urgent one. Hollie wanted to know the man behind the fangs, and although she wouldn't have chosen this situation, being trapped with a vamp, now that he was opening up, she found herself craving for knowledge about her companion. Samael turned me, yes, but it wasn't a typical transformation. Most vampires are turned by other vampires. They are bitten, are fed the blood of their master, and die, only to be reborn under darkness. They do not age. They cannot change their appearance, and they are constrained by their bloodline. Its strength determines their own abilities. But my turning was quite different, he explained. I was still a boy, barely past puberty. My growth should have been stunted there, but Samael performed a ritual, his magic distorting the usual boundaries of my vampiric nature. I could grow, and did, until I reached full manhood. There I froze, and as for my powers, they're substantial when compared to others of my species. Although he has never told me so, I believe Samael's own blood was used to transform me. He is my master, and his strength, or at least a small fraction of it, is mine. The devastation that his master had wreaked on his life was staggering, and another brick in Hollie's emotional wall tumbled as her sympathy grew. Maz had been abandoned, tortured, manipulated, and then transformed, with no choice in any of it. No wonder he's made such a royal screw-up out of our own meeting. He's never had an example of a healthy relationship, despite his millennia of existence. Still, from what little she'd learned about matehood, it didn't matter if one had relationship experience. Fate called the shots, not suitability. But that means you have to accept the concept of eternal mates as a reality. Are you really ready to do that? Not without some more information, she answered herself. Gently extracting her hand from his grip, she folded it with its twin on her lap and considered how to raise the subject tactfully. There is something I need to know. Something that I don't understand. It seems like at crucial points in your life you were not in control of your circumstances. Isn't matehood sort of the same thing? You're accepting that you have no agency in the process? Destiny has chosen the one you will spend your life with, regardless of your thoughts on the matter. Her question seemed to catch him off guard. It may seem that way, but you've got the wrong idea about the mechanism behind matehood. It isn't that we have no control. The bond transcends control. It is a reunion of sorts, making two halves whole again. So if I'm half of a whole, and so is he, what sort of messed up whole would that turn out to be? Hollie couldn't understand why fate would declare the two of them a match. It made no sense. Why me? She asked, her voice coming out smaller than she would have expected. What is it about me that made fate pair us for eternity? The question hung between them for a moment, unanswered. Hollie was surprised how on edge she was, the tension climbing while she waited for him to speak. The longer he paused, the worse it got, until a fear she hadn't even known she had surfaced from the deep. It has nothing to do with who I am, the unique snowflake that is Hollie Townsend. He does as destiny says, not his own tastes. If Maz believed a woman was his mate, who she was inside and out didn't matter. I'm a prop, nothing more. For as much as she'd tried to avoid the whole mate thing, she now realized that she'd somehow become invested. Her hopes for reaching accord with the vampire plummeted as the silence stretched out between them. Chapter 20. Maz was afraid to speak, afraid to move, terrified that he might do something to burst the bubble of connection that had formed around them in this moment. He hadn't expected to find himself trapped with his mate, engaged in a deeply personal conversation, and now able to explain what having her as a mate meant to him. It was more than he could have hoped for, and it could all go wrong in a second. She's so close. I can feel the warmth of her skin. Hollie had touched him earlier, and his body had been rocketed by the shockwave of that contact. Being this close, smelling her scent, feeling her concern for him, it was going to his head like the strongest of alcohols. But the worst was the vein pulsing in her neck, her creamy skin almost translucent, the blood beneath the surface blue until it was exposed to the air. The pulse there hypnotized him as he imagined the thick heat of her blood pumping just inches from him. It took everything he had inside him not to plunge his fangs into her delicate neck and taste her blood. I know it will be sweet, because it couldn't be anything else. Maz forced his thoughts back to the present, realizing that he hadn't answered her question,
and Hollie seemed to be wilting the longer he took to respond. I must be honest. I'm struggling to find the right way to express myself. A way that won't have you running for the hills again. She swallowed, and he had to pull his eyes away from her throat once more. I know how important this conversation is, he told her, reaching for her hand. Miracle of miracles, she let him take it and enfold it into his larger, cooler one. And I don't want to get it wrong. When she didn't respond, he cast his mind about for a good way to start. Why not at the beginning? Perhaps it would be best to explain a little of our history before telling you how matehood works, at least for vampires. I cannot speak to how the other races with fated mates behave. At her nod, he continued. Long ago, when the web was young, the forces of light were engaged in conflict with those on the side of darkness. One race above all others was true champions of the light. You humans call them angels. Angels are real? She asked him, her lovely eyes wide. I mean, I should have guessed, considering all the other things I've seen lately. Hollie shook her head, her fiery hair tumbling around her shoulders. Still, it's kind of crazy to find out that all of those species from myth and legend are real, and they've been around me all this time without me noticing. You're in for even more surprises, Maz warned her. Vampires are the offspring of angels. Her mouth dropped open, an adorable expression of astonishment on her perfect face. Vampires and angels, but how? Have you heard the name Shayatan before? Hollie's face screwed up in thought. I think so. On Araman, maybe. Shayatan is the real devil, more so than even Samael, his servant. He was able to capture a pair of angels and pollute their essence, perverting them into creatures that are the opposite of angels, while still retaining some of their powers, if in another form. You can't be serious. Vampires come from angels. It sounded like she was trying to convince herself. That's sick, isn't it? Turning an angel into something. Hollie's words stopped suddenly, and she looked up at him with a flash of guilt on her features. She remembered who she's talking to. Maz tried not to think about her low opinion of his kind. I can't really blame her. We're monsters. It is sick, he agreed, and the sickest part is how Shayatan corrupted their essence, instead of sharing the light inside of themselves to strengthen others, which is why the angels are the light's own champions. He made them takers, feeding off others' life essence to sustain and strengthen themselves. The first two vampires went mad at what they had become, and Shayatan himself was forced to put them down. So rabid had they become. Maz risked a glance at his companion, afraid what he was telling her might again alter her opinion of them. Their interaction had been a pendulum of sorts, swinging from terrible to okay and back again. If she knows what I am, if I admit that I am the leech she's called me, there will be little chance of convincing her that I am a suitable companion for eternity. She looked as if she was digesting the information he'd given her, but as of now, he couldn't see any judgment in her expression. Maz took a breath and risked it all, most of him believing that what he told her next would sour her on mates forever. A vampire and his mate are bonded by blood. There is a special quality in a mate's blood that attracts us like nothing else. This quality tells me that you are my mate, that your blood and mine are bonded, and sharing blood only makes that bond more intense and more rewarding. I don't understand. You haven't tasted my blood yet. He could tell she wasn't comfortable saying what she had. So how do you know we're bonded? I don't need to taste you to know. But if I were to taste you, it would strengthen the bond between us, making our connection undeniable. Something in your blood resonates with mine. Think of it like singing in harmony. Our pitches might be difficult, but the melody is not. Hollie nodded. I used to sing in the church choir, so I understand and appreciate your analogy, but if I'm being honest, the idea of sharing blood with you to become closer still spooks me. I understand that it is an adjustment for you, he said, squeezing her hand in his. But I can assure you, with every fiber of my being, that I will never willingly hurt you. In fact,
I can't hurt you. Hurting you only hurts myself. What do you mean? Maz wasn't sure how well she'd grasped the reciprocal relationship of matehood. The connection that runs between us, especially after we've shared our essences, he continued, being careful not to use the word blood since she seemed to dislike the thought, is like a cord tying us together. What you feel, I feel too, in a sense. And if you're hurt, it hurts me. So hurting you is literally hurting myself. Hollie put her hands to her forehead, a frantic look in her eyes. This conversation is really intense. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this topic. The more you talk about it, the more matehood sounds like some sort of toxic codependency. His stomach plummeted, his anxiety level cranking up. I'm screwing this all up. How long before she tells me she refuses to be my mate? How long before she rejects me? Even the thought of her rejection had him on the verge of vomiting. If I could only show you, he said in desperation, you'd see that there's nothing toxic about it. Mates who accept their connection are some of the happiest beings you'll ever see, and I promise you, I will do everything I can to shield you from any discomfort. Can you really make that promise? An inner voice asked him. You know how Samael feels about eternal mates. If he discovers you found yours, then only the gods know what he might do about it. Maz didn't like to think about the consequences of his claiming his mate. He couldn't, since Samael was a force he couldn't oppose. He won't find out, he told himself, and I will keep Hollie safe. What will happen to me when you bite me? Her voice sounded so small, it tugged at his heartstrings. Before he could reassure her, she lobbed more questions at him. Will you train me? Make me like you? Will I die? Her breath hitched on the last word, and Maz could see that she was truly afraid of the prospect. Not exactly. It's hard to explain without you experiencing it, but I can be careful. Make it as painless as possible. Just a sip of your precious blood. That is all I would risk. At first. I don't think I can handle even a sip. Her words were barely about a whisper, and he felt her hands start to tremble in his. Maz couldn't hold back any more, her worry bringing his protective instinct online. He moved closer, putting an arm around her and drawing her into his chest. He inhaled heavily, close to burying his face in her hair, so delectable did she smell. Clutching her tighter, his need became a physical thing, a substance with weight, enough heft to drive him to her. Putting a finger under her chin, he tilted her face up to his. Her green eyes were shining in the candlelight, her skin glowing like a Renaissance painting. But it was her plump pink lips that captured and held his attention. He'd been obsessing about tasting her blood, but now all he could think about was the feel of her lips against his. His restraint snapped at the thought, and Maz lowered his lips to hers. The contact set off an explosion inside him, like he'd swallowed pure sunshine. She was stiff at first, but under his tender touch, she soon succumbed, surrendering to him and accepting his tribute. That surrender unleashed a torrent inside him. My mate in my arms, her lips against mine. Could anything be finer than this? Chapter 21. Wow. Just wow. Hollie had been kissed before, although it had been a while since she'd come across anyone she was willing to know so intimately in Watoma. In high school, she'd enjoyed learning about herself, what she liked, what she craved in a connection with a boy, and that had meant a fair amount of making out with a few locals who'd subsequently left Watoma behind. But those interactions had been years ago. In her mid-20s, she was already starting to feel like a spinster. There is nothing spinster-like about this kiss. Maz was the single greatest kisser she'd ever met, and Hollie wanted to benefit from his skills. His mouth was masterful against hers, seemingly weaving a spell of temptation that Hollie found it impossible to resist. She'd tried at first, but he'd worn away her resistance until Hollie felt like she might die if he stopped kissing her. Her arms wove themselves around his neck on instinct, and she pressed herself tightly against him, her body needing a closeness that her mind hadn't yet accepted. His muscles felt unyielding, a hard complement to the softness of his lips. Hollie was losing herself in the kiss, forgetting all the madness of Maz's pursuit. The kiss wasn't about thinking, it was about feeling, and being this near to him made her skin tingle and her insides hum. She could almost sense the connection he'd spoken about as a physical thing between them, that chord that was vibrating with the passion of their coming together. Shared suffering had unlocked the door, and Maz was wasting no time walking through it. Despite what she told him earlier, she now saw him as a man, one who'd experienced loss like she had. Although she couldn't forget what he'd put her through, part of her might be willing to forgive, given the trauma he'd gone through. It's hard to hold a grudge when this feels so good. Maz kissed her breathless, and finally she had to come up for air. That didn't mean the vampire was ready to break their embrace. His hands came up to cup her face gently, and he kissed his way over her cheek, his touch as gentle as a raindrop against her skin. She didn't struggle, didn't want to. All she wanted was more of the thrill he was giving her. He worked his way down to her throat, his mouth seeming to take on a greater urgency as his lips traced downwards. They reached the nape of her neck, lingering there, and Hollie's head fell back. She was lost in sensation, a slave to the pleasure he was bringing her. "Please don't stop," her mind begged. "I want this. I need this. Please." Her nails dug into his shoulders, but his muscles were like stone. Still, the vampire let out a ragged groan against her skin, the proof of her need for him seeming to drive his arousal higher. Her insides lit up at the sound, her own excitement ratcheting up. They were feeding off each other's lust, and it was the most stimulating thing she'd ever experienced. And then she felt them, his fangs, their points brushing against her neck. It was like being caught in a cold spring downpour. Her arousal instantly doused. Hollie's eyes flew open, and she shoved the vampire away. With an accusing glare, she slapped a hand over her neck at the place he'd been lovingly worshipping moments before. His betrayal turned her insides to ice. "You creep!" she cried, shaking with the adrenaline that his kiss turned prelude to a bite had called up. Maz's face filled with shame that quickly turned to contrition. "Hollie, I wasn't going to. Don't bother lying to me. You've made it clear that biting me is your intention. All that talk about sharing blood, about bonding, I'm a fool. You're going to take what you want no matter what I say, aren't you?" "You're wrong," he insisted, attempting to put his hands on her shoulders. Hollie slapped them away, retreating again until her back was against the cool, mirrored wall. "I would never betray your trust in that way." Hollie scoffed, shaking her head. "You've done nothing but railroad your way into my life for weeks, and now I'm supposed to believe you're ready to take it slowly? You're just trying to manipulate me, to trick me for this sadistic game you're playing, but you can count me out." A ripple of anger passed over his features. "If I wanted to bite you, I would have," he said stiffly. "If I wanted to drain you, I could have done it at any moment, including the first night I laid eyes on you. You would have been a corpse long ago if that was my intent." Hollie shivered, the coolness in his words putting cracks in their fledgling connection. He took another step toward her, and she looked around for something to defend herself with. For all the good it will do, he pretty much just admitted that he can do whatever he wants with me, and I'll never be able to stop him from doing so. "Hollie," he tried again, his tone gentler. "I'm sorry if I scared you. I will admit the mate bond makes it extremely hard for me not to claim you, and in that moment, I wasn't the only one who was caught up in the attraction between us." "Oh, great. Now we're victim blaming," she muttered, then reached for a heavy book that was resting on a table beside her. "Stay back or I'll give you such a whack with this thing." The vampire then said the thing guaranteed to make things worse. "Calm down." He took another step toward her, and Hollie felt her hurt and rage boil over. She swung the book as hard as she could at him. Maz caught it effortlessly, ripping the book from her hand and tossing it over her shoulder. "Come on now. There is no need for violence," says the guy who was a second away from tearing my throat out.
His expression grew dark. I would never do that to you. I explained how hurting one's mate only ends up hurting you. Funny, I didn't feel anything when I hit you with that book, she mocked him. Maybe I'm not your mate after all, and you can leave me the heck alone for good. She could see the hurt on his face, but Hollie ignored it, clinging to her anger. He's the one in the wrong here, not me. The argument was interrupted by the sudden sound of glass shattering. Hollie whirled around to see a pair of arms push themselves through the hole, and then a head appeared. It belonged to the witch, Cass, who looked down on her with relief. There you are! We were looking all over for you. I thought that maybe... Her words trailed off when she caught sight of the vampire, who was staring at her with a mixture of annoyance and surprise. Cass let out a yelp of fear, her arms reaching down to grab onto Hollie. Hold on, she ordered, and Hollie wasted no time doing as she said, reaching back up to grip the witch tightly. Cass yanked her through the hole in the wall she created, pulling her through darkness and into an unfamiliar space with white plaster walls and a large wooden table and chairs. Hollie looked around her while the witch quickly closed the hole she'd made, breathing heavily by the time it was done. I'm out! I'm free! The realization should have made her feel better, but all she felt was empty inside. The last few hours had been an emotional roller coaster, and everything was still too raw for her to be able to process. Cass turned back to her, calling out to the pair of Fae who were guarding the open door. I've got her! About time, Phaedra grumbled, remaining at her post while Taylor rushed inside to embrace Hollie tightly. Are you okay? The Fae asked, concern writ large on her features. Hollie didn't know how to answer her, so her feelings did it for her. She burst into tears, but when Taylor asked what was wrong, she didn't feel able to tell her. Cass passed her a tissue conjured out of the air, and Hollie took it gratefully. She pulled out of Taylor's arms and looked around her. Where are we? In the tavern on Samothrace, in one of their private dining rooms, Cass answered. The witch wouldn't let us go anywhere, Phaedra muttered from the doorway. I suggested we call for Fae backup, but she insisted she had it handled. And I did, Cass replied tartly. Phaedra scoffed at the other woman's flippancy. After how many hours? How did you find me? Hollie asked, ignoring their bickering. It wasn't easy, Cass admitted. The High Council expended considerable resources to find you. Resources I hope you will be reimbursing, by the way. Phaedra ignored her, but Taylor gave her a tentative nod. Our best locators scribed for hours to work at your location. I don't think I've ever seen them work so hard. There were several magical blocks in place to keep whatever that place is secret. The magic in those blocks was like nothing the Council had ever seen before. Hollie swallowed, wondering who the pocket realm they'd been trapped in belonged to. Before, she would have thought the vampire, but after what they'd shared, she realized she didn't think he was behind their imprisonment. What happened? How did I end up in that place with the vampire? The vamp was there, Phaedra spat, finally turning away from the doorway and closing the door behind her. He trapped you somewhere. I don't think it was him. Cass nodded, lending support to her theory. The magic surrounding that place could never have been placed by a vampire. Never say never. He surprised us before, Phaedra warned. You were alone together for a long time. Why didn't the leech drain you? Hollie rubbed her arms, thinking back to the kiss and its uncomfortable ending. I don't know. I thought he was about to, but you rescued me just in the nick of time. The word nick reminded her again of his fangs at her neck, and she shivered. Now that you're back, we need to get out of here as soon as possible. Phaedra's tone was adamant. If the leech comes for her again, Samothrace is going to be the first place he looks. Don't worry about it. Even if he does come here, he won't find her. Cass was confident, giving Hollie a grin. Your location is being shielded by a constantly revolving hex compliments of the High Council of Witches. You're safe for the time being. Hollie sat down heavily in one of the chairs, hoping against hope that the witch's words were true. She was overwhelmed by the kiss and its aftermath, not to mention her own reaction to the vampire. He'd managed to tear down her wall enough to climb inside and reach her, and when he did, she hadn't turned him away. I wanted it, wanted him, but you shouldn't always get what you want. Rubbing at the place on her neck, where his fangs had grazed,
She wondered if she was safe, like the witch had said. Hollie wasn't so sure. I might never feel safe again. Chapter 22. Tears were bubbling just under the surface, and Hollie stuck a hand in the pocket of her dress, remembering the handkerchief Maz had given her. It was still there, and she pulled it out, turning it over in her hand. There was a small embroidered M in black thread against the white silk. Raising it to her face, she dabbed at her eyes. Hollie caught a whiff of the vampire scent, sandalwood and spice, and closed her eyes, the memory of him holding her, close, washing over her. The debate raged between Phaedra and Cass, but she tuned them out. Taylor pulled a chair out next to her, leaning in to touch her arm gently.
"Are you okay?"
Hollie shook her head, the tears welling up again and spilling down her cheeks.
"I thought I knew what he wanted, thought he was toying with me, using this alleged mate thing to manipulate me, but now I'm not so sure."
She looked up at her friend.
"I think he believes it."
Taylor nodded.
"They are relentless when attempting to claim their mates, but vampires are susceptible to matehood as any species blessed with that connection."
Relentless doesn't begin to describe Maz. Suddenly, Hollie was spilling out everything that happened, her voice low, her tone urgent. She needed to get it out, to tell someone, to share the burden before it drove her crazy.
"I'm not cut out for all this drama."
The friendly Fae listened, nodding along and smiling at parts. But when Hollie told her about the kiss and his near bite, her expression tightened.
"I have heard about vampires claiming mates before. They are single-minded in their determination, but it is true what he told you. Vampires do not hurt their mates. On the contrary, they are their mates' fiercest protectors. You could do worse than having a vamp watching your back."
Taylor's words surprised her.
"Are you serious? What about the constant danger of having a bite taken out of me? Of having all my blood drained out of my system until I'm left like a deflated balloon after a child's birthday party? Tell me more about these balloons. Is that what they're called?"
It seemed the human affairs scholar couldn't turn off her quest for knowledge. Hollie ignored her question.
"What if I don't want a vampire for a mate?"
The Fae let out a heavy breath.
"That's a big question. You've tried running, and it clearly hasn't worked. What if you changed tactics? Instead of fleeing the vampire, you told him to go away, to leave you alone."
Hollie shook her head.
"Don't you know how many times I've already done that?" "Yes, but not in a formal way," Taylor explained. "The next time he comes for you, you should tell him that you're not interested in being his mate. Tell him to go away, to leave you alone, and that you revoke his claim as your mate and reject him fully and for all time."
Reject him? Hollie remembered what Maz had told her about the pain of a mate's rejection. To be rejected by your eternal mate, the agony of that is unfathomable. Can I really do that to Maz? She might not want to have anything else to do with the vamp, but that didn't mean she wanted to destroy him in the process, did it?
"I believe that is your best shot of shooing the vampire off and resuming a normal life."
The Fae's voice was filled with certainty, but Hollie felt less certain than ever. A normal life? What does that even look like anymore? Could she really go back to Wisconsin and pretend that she'd never met these fantastic creatures? That she'd never experienced the thrill of a vampire's kiss? "I don't even understand how I ended up in this situation," Hollie muttered, meaning being wrapped up in a matehood mess with a vampire. Taylor, however, took her words to meaning something else.
"I think I've figured out what happened in the common room. My ring of protection somehow got entangled with the portal Cass was trying to open. The spells got twisted together, creating an unstable mixture. Unstable magic can be attracted to any other spells in use, and when Phaedra went to blast the vamp, our twisted spells interfered, knotting up her spell with ours. Since the spells focused on you and the vampire, you were both somehow sucked into a portal to, well, wherever you ended up."
And where was that exactly? After practically turning the room upside down, Hollie had a burning curiosity to know who the pocket realm belonged to.
"Now that I don't know, but maybe Cass could."
A sudden knock at the door interrupted Taylor and drew Hollie's attention away from the Fae. Cass pushed past Phaedra to open in, swinging it wide to admit two elderly women in identical purple robes.
The one with the hooked nose spoke first.
A vampire has been detected in the woods around Samothrace.
The other woman, her grey hair in a thick braid lying over her shoulder and a wart on her chin, continued.
The High Council is sending a strike force to eliminate him.
Eliminate? Alarm battered her. Hollie might not want to have to see the vampire again herself, but that didn't mean she wanted him dead. Wait, she said, but her words were lost in the commotion that followed the old woman's statement. It's about bloody time, Phaedra said, an eager grin on her face. What do I sign up for the hunting party? Taylor shot her fellow Fae a dirty look, but it had no effect. Cass inclined her head, indicating her acceptance of the vampire's fate, then turned to the warrior woman. We witches have things well in hand, so you can continue to cool your heels. Oh, you would just love that, Phaedra shot back, her wings fluttering in agitation. But I really must insist. I've been up against this vamp before, and I know I can hold my own.
We've all been up against him before,
Taylor reminded her. And if you were any great shakes, Cass added, then we wouldn't still be dealing with this little problem, would we? Phaedra exploded in anger, charging toward the witch. Cass, in return, lifted her hands in defense. Hollie could see little sparks of lightning shooting between them. Taylor stepped between the two rivals, attempting to calm everyone down. It was the witch with the wart, however, that achieved that goal. She clapped her hands, and thunder boomed around them. All eyes turned to her.
We did not come here to debate, nor to solicit aid. We witches are more than a match for one misplaced leech. We only came to inform you as the leech is your problem, but now he's ours.
The hook-nosed witch raised her hand toward the opposite wall, where a black liquid appeared, a vertical pool that swirled in a circle motion before resolving into a steady portal. The black liquid turned clear, and Hollie could see the gloomy forest at the borders of Samothrace on the other side. She watched as the two women walked through it, debating whether to follow after them, even though they hadn't offered a lift to the forest. I should warn Maz, she thought, but fear made her hesitate. Her last trip through a portal hadn't gone as planned. By the time she'd forced herself to stand up, the portal closed behind the elderly witches with an audible pop. Are they going to kill him? She asked Cass, even though she already knew the answer.
It's too dangerous to let him live, the witch replied simply.
This isn't what I want, so if all of this is on my behalf, then please call it off. The urgency of her words was obvious from her tone. Phaedra turned to her, her eyes narrowing. What exactly happened to you when you were alone with the vampire? Hollie ignored the question. Please, Cass, call them back. Tell them that he doesn't have to die. I can go to him and convince him to leave. Even if it means breaking him with my rejection, it's better than having his blood on my hands. The thought of blood made her feel squeamish, but she pushed past it, hurrying to the witch's side and grabbing her arm. Please, I'm begging you. The witch shook her head. I'm sorry, Hollie, but it is done. This time she didn't even feel the tears as they fell. Taylor put her arm around her, attempting to comfort her.
Perhaps what the vampire has said is true after all. Have you discovered feelings for your mate?
Hollie looked at her, stricken. Part of her wanted to insist that the Fae not call Maz her mate, but another part of her wondered if there was some truth to the woman's words. I don't want him to die, she answered. If those witches kill him now, it will be my fault.
Oh, Hollie, that's not true, Taylor said, rubbing her back gently. He feeds off life, remember? That is a crime in and of itself.
Life feeds on life, Hollie replied, repeating what the vampire told her. I eat meat and so do you, and plants are alive before we harvest them as well. Every being needs to get its energy from somewhere, some life force. It seems arbitrary to punish him and not me. Phaedra's eyes went wide. She gripped Hollie's head between her hands and peered into her eyes. What's gotten into you? Some charm or hex? When she didn't see anything, she released her and put her hands on her hips. I know what this is. The leech used his compulsion on you. Compulsion? Hollie asked, confused. Yes, it's like a form of hypnotism vamps can use to get what they want out of someone. He must have done it to you. I don't think he did. But can I be sure? Hollie shook her head, not willing to be distracted. Time was of the essence, and if she hoped to help the vampire, she had to do it in a hurry. He didn't. I'm sure of it. Now, will you help me warn Maz? Absolutely not, Phaedra said with a shake of her head. Cass only shrugged. Fine, Hollie said through grit teeth. If you're not going to help me, I'll do it on my own. She marched through the door and ripped it open, a plan already forming in her mind. Let's hope that warlock is still at the dice table.
Chapter 23. The tavern's common room had quieted in her absence, and Hollie realized it must now be the wee hours of the morning in Summerthrees. There was little sign that a battle of sorts had taken place earlier, other than a scorch mark on the surface of one of the tables. Despite the late hour, the dice table was still going strong. The crowd that had circled the players had gone home, but Mr. Toad and the Wolfman remained in their chairs, looking a little worse for wear. "All right, gentlemen," Jude said, his grin as jovial as it had been before Hollie had been pulled into the portal with Maz. "My hot streak is just getting started, but in the interest of saving time, what say we go straight to the big bets?" Hollie lunged forward, but found herself caught short. "Whatever you're thinking, rethink it." Phaedra's face was like stone, her grip on Hollie's arm even stronger.
I know how you feel about this, Phaedra. Believe me, everyone does, Hollie replied, yanking against the Fae's hold. But I'm not going to let Maz walk into an ambush of bloodthirsty witches. Why not? He set an ambush for us. Remember the zombies, or have you already forgotten their wretched smell? Maz said he wasn't responsible for the zombies. Wow, this woman is strong. No matter how hard Hollie tried to free herself, the Fae didn't loosen her grip. And you believe him? Phaedra's mouth was a thin line. Hollie, you don't know what you're dealing with. Vampires are master manipulators. He's messing with your mind. The clock was ticking, and Hollie wasn't getting anywhere while the Fae was holding her up. Her anger exploded, and she let Phaedra have it. My poor feeble human mind? Oh, no. Whatever shall I do? Ignoring the warrior woman's surprised expression, she gave one more hard tug, and at last managed to free herself. I can handle myself, thank you. I can't protect you if you won't let me, Phaedra told her as she walked away. Hollie didn't respond, didn't want to think about how she was risking her relationship with the Fae. Phaedra had been there for her when Hollie needed her, and breaking up their friendship over a man sucked. But I can't let them kill him. She knew the others didn't understand, but they hadn't been there with him, hadn't listened to his story. He doesn't deserve this. Jude, she croaked when she reached the dice table. Her breath was already sawing out of her after the effort of getting Phaedra to release her. I need your help. Hold on, honey. I'm about to take the entire pot with this next roll. The warlock dumped the dice cup onto the table, revealing a 2, a 5, a 1, and 2 4s. Jude groaned, but the rest of the table sent up a shout of delight. Well, you're certainly not my good luck charm, he grumbled, passing the dice cup to the werewolf. What do you need? I need you to take me to the forest outside the city right now. Hollie could hear her own frantic tone, hoping it was conveying the urgency of her need. Jude blinked, surprised. It will be dawn soon. We should wait until the sun is up to head to the borderlands. He watched the wolfman throw 3 3s and 2 5s and let out a groan. You might really be a jinx, he said, turning his attention back to her. This is serious, she said, putting a hand on his arm. She'd been about to say friend, but hesitated. An acquaintance of mine is in danger, and I must warn him. Acquaintance, eh? Anyone I know? Jude waggled his eyebrows at her. Normally his antics would make her smile, but she was too anxious about Maz and the witches that were after him to pay attention to them now. I know you have magical powers, so use them to transport me to the woods right now. No, please. I thought you were a polite girl. Jude's eyes were back on the table, the pile of coins in front of him dwindling with each roll. She grabbed him by his shirt front, tired of trying to drag his attention back to her and her plight. Come on, Jude. He gently removed her hands and gave her a look. From your reaction, it sounds like this acquaintance is actually more than an acquaintance. I'll owe you, she told him. I'm begging. The werewolf sent up a howl, and Jude hit the table with his fist. Fine.
he growled, sliding his remaining few coins into his hand and shoving them into a pocket. "You really are Jinx, you know." Hollie didn't care. She might have felt relief at his capitulation, but her anxiety was too high. It's been at least 5 minutes since the witches informed Cass of their intentions. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. Phaedra stormed toward them, and Hollie grabbed Jude's hand, shouting for him to hurry. "Don't you dare!" the Fae started, but the rest of her words were drowned out by a whoosh of air. Suddenly, Hollie was standing in the dismal woods outside Samothrace's capital. Swiveling around to scan the area, she looked for any sign of the vampire or the contingent of witches ready to dispatch him. "Where's your acquaintance?" Jude asked her, his irritation overriding his usual cheerful demeanor. "I'm not certain," she replied, squinting into the stands of trees around them. It was still dark, although not as dark as midnight. Dawn was already starting to lighten the gloom, but that in-between light made it difficult for Hollie to differentiate between an object and its shadow. "It's hard to see." The warlock snapped his fingers, and a little ball of light appeared in front of them. "Better?" "Yes, thank you." Hollie started picking her way forward, looking for any traces that meant someone had come this way before them. I wish I had paid attention the one time my father took me hunting. I was too sad for the deer he was shooting after, and started shouting to scare them away. "I know this might not be the best timing," Jude said, some of his earlier attitude returning. "But have you given any thought to my offer? Come traveling with me. I'm a lot more fun than the Fae, and between me and you, witches are the pits." "That's odd, coming from a warlock." Hollie was trying to keep her eyes on the trees, but she kept having to look down to make sure she wasn't tripping over a stray tree root. Jude laughed, the sound echoing off the woods around them. "You think I'm a warlock? Oh, could you imagine? Prostituting my magic for coin. Give me a nice clean dice game any day." "But you were losing," Hollie pointed out. "Wait, he's not a warlock. Then what is he?" "Only because you showed up and broke my concentration. You haven't yet thanked me for this little favor, by the way," he said, stepping over a root, then shoving a low-hanging branch out of his way. He didn't bother to hold the branch for Hollie, and she had to throw up her arm to block it from hitting her face when it snapped back into place. "Thank you," she said dutifully, too distracted to fully pay attention to the conversation. "Well," he drawled, "where should we go for our first adventure? And please don't say a realm ruled by Fae. They're not exactly my cup of tea." "I don't know," she said, then flinched when a bird flew out of a nearby tree, the flapping of its wings startling her. "How about something you do know, then?" Jude said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "Tell me about this guy we're going to warn." "What's there to tell?" Hollie asked, suddenly nervous. "He's someone I know, and he's in danger." "You're a real sharer, aren't you?" he mocked. "Please stop drowning me in details." Hollie threw him an annoyed look over her shoulder. "He's tall, well, over 6 feet, dark hair with lighter highlights, blue eyes, usually when they aren't flashing red, and don't forget to mention his fangs and the fact that he drinks blood. He sounds like a real winner. When's the wedding?" "Shut up," Hollie said, tired of Jude's teasing. "Sounds like I hit a nerve. What is this guy to you? Your mate?" Hollie tensed, then tried not to show a reaction. There were too many red flags for all of this to be a coincidence. Then again, just because he wasn't a warlock didn't mean he didn't have powers that were beyond her understanding. Mind reading is back on the table. "It's complicated," she said at last. "Most things are." Jude ran a hand through his wavy hair. "What did he do to attract the witch's attention?" "I never mentioned witches," she said, a thread of unease creeping into her belly. He always seems to know more than what I've told him. If he isn't a warlock, then maybe he isn't reading my thoughts, but what is he? "We're on Samothrace," he pointed out. "Home of the witches?" "Right," she said, but somehow his explanation didn't make her feel any better. Hollie let out a frustrated groan. "Where is he?" Just then a loud bang rang out in the distance. "What was that?" Jude wondered aloud, a moment before a ball made of fire streaked through the sky overhead. "If I had to guess, your friend is that way." He pointed in the direction the fireball had been headed.
No duh, detective. Hollie didn't bother validating his statement. She took off in the direction of the battle, fear making it hard to breathe. Through the trees she could see a small clearing, flames coming up to block the path a few yards ahead. By the time she'd reached the fire, Jude was beside her. He leaned down and blew on the flames, a wind kicking up to extinguish them. Hollie didn't have time to marvel at his magic. However, because she could finally see the battlefield and things looked bleak. Across the clearing she could see the vampire, arrayed in his long black coat that was singed at the edges, hissing at a line of women in identical purple robes. They'd linked arms and were walking slowly toward him. "I'm too late!" Hollie cried out, feeling like a failure. She rounded on Jude. "If you hadn't been so dang interested in that stupid dice game—" "Dice are never stupid. Their users, however, are a different story." "What is wrong with you?" she asked, her patience with Jude and his remarks at an end. "That man out there is going to die, and you can't even be bothered to care. What is wrong with everyone in this blasted web?" Jude shrugged. "Death is a part of life. When you've been around as long as I have, you've seen a lot of death. What's one more?" Hollie turned away, her eyes filling with tears. A day ago she might have felt the same way. She certainly would have never rushed to the vampire's aid, but things were different now. At least they felt different. Her heart was pounding, her limbs trembling. Terror was riding her hard, whipping her with guilt. "This is all my fault. If I'd never come to the witches—" A sudden flash of bright lavender light brought her attention back to the battle. Each individual witch was outlined in a glow that seemed to seep into their skin. Hollie's hands flexed, her nails digging furrows into her palms, but she couldn't feel the pain. Her eyes were glued to the vampire. Then he lifted his head, his eyes locking with hers, and she felt a jolt of energy that seemed to shoot from him directly into her. Clutching her chest, she fought the panic that clawed up her insides. Is this what having a mate feels like? The realization that she might be buying into the whole matehood mythology shook her, but it was hard to ignore the intensity of her emotions in that moment. "Don't die," she told him, knowing he couldn't hear it. At least, Maz broke eye contact and turned his attention back to the witches. With a flash of his fangs, he rushed forward, a streaking blur, to meet his attackers on the field of battle. Chapter 24. He doesn't look frightened, not one bit. What he did look like was a magnificent warrior. Although her departure from Earth wasn't that long ago, Hollie felt she'd had a full experience during her time in the web. She'd seen fights between the Fae and Hellspawn, had seen both Bracken and Dev take down enemies with both speed and incredible strength, but she'd never seen anything as impressive as the vampire. His speed was incredible, moving so quickly he was barely perceptible. Hollie watched him appear beside the last purple-robed witch in the line and put a hand on her arm, his intentions unclear. The moment Maz made contact, the lavender glow returned, this time crackling like live energy. The vampire bounded backward, shaking the hand he'd used to touch his opponent. Hollie thought the energy must have stung him hard enough to retreat, but he surprised her by continuing down the line, slashing out against the witches in rapid succession, his attacks so quick she could barely catch them. Over and over he battered their shield, and over his attacks were deflected by the energy field. The vampire's hands were smoking by the time he reached the end of the line, and Hollie could see brutal burns on his hands. He flashed away once again, the energy having stung him badly enough for him to retreat to his former position. The witches continued their advance, unyielding in their persistence. Why doesn't he just go? Hollie wondered, concerned by his wounds. He could regroup, figure out a way around the witches. She shook her head. Here I am, rooting for the vampire. It was true that she didn't want to see Maz destroyed, but neither did she want to see him slice and chew his way through the 6 women facing him down. Why doesn't he leave? The answer to her question hit her, and she stumbled back against a nearby tree. He won't leave because I'm here. That's why. Hollie felt more helpless than she had since the period after her mother's death, when her father had been like a zombie himself, shambling through the house, wrapped in the memories of a woman he'd never see again. Is that what Maz is afraid of? That if he takes his eye off me for a moment,
I could disappear and he'd never see me again? Her chest ached at the thought, but she forced her mind to shut off so that she could focus entirely on the battle. Looks like your man has his work cut out for him. Your vampire, I should say, because no mortal man could withstand the onslaught of 6 linked witches. As if to accentuate his point, the vampire flickered, only to reappear on the other end of the line, his legs sweeping out to attempt to knock one off her feet. When he made contact, the light fled to life again, crackling like a live wire, and although she saw Maz wince, indicating he'd taken damage, he still managed to achieve his goal. The witch on the far end toppled over, her arm unraveling from her companion's, who was trying to keep her own footing. When their arms unlinked, there was another burst of lavender light, this time fading quickly. No glow, Hollie observed. Did Maz just take out their shield? The vampire was quick to snatch up his prey, grabbing the arms of the fallen witch and vanishing, only to reappear a few feet in front of the rest of the line, his claws at her neck. Let me pass, and I will release your friend. Persist in blocking me from my goal, and she will pay for your mistake. The meaning of his words were obvious. He was threatening to harm the witch. Hollie felt sick to her stomach, the worst of her worries coming true right in front of her. Don't hurt her, please. This just got interesting, Jude said, leaning against a nearby tree and crossing his arms. There's a real damned if he do and damned if he don't quality to this little situation, wouldn't you agree? I see you decided not to take my earlier advice and shut up, she grumbled, her eyes never leaving the vampire. The witches stopped moving forward, but they didn't seem interested in a prisoner swap. Without warning, the ground beneath the vamp began to shake. Maz disappeared with the witch again, reappearing several feet away, but the earthquake continued, making it hard to stay upright. Distracted by the seismic challenge, the witch in his grasp saw her opportunity. Right before Hollie's eyes, she suddenly sprouted nasty spikes all over her body. They resembled the bone horns of a rhino, and they stabbed into the vampire, gouging deep holes in his jacket and the body underneath. Unable to hold on to his spike-laden prey, he released her, only to double back on the line of witches. Appearing behind the middle woman, the one Hollie had met earlier and christened Warty, Maz grabbed a hold of her gray braid and yanked her backwards, out of the line and onto the ground. Warty wasn't about to go down without a fight, however. She weaved her hands together in an intricate pattern, and her hair began to unravel from the braid, lengthening and thickening and climbing up Maz's arms to encircle his throat. Maz ripped at the hair with his claws, his face turning even paler. Hook-Nose, the other witch from the tavern, took the opportunity to rain down hail on the vamp the size of softballs. One hit him directly on his head, causing him to stagger. He's strong, but maybe not strong enough. Hollie fought the panic that was threatening to engulf her. She was a helpless human, fragile and weak with no magic of her own. I can't help him, but maybe someone else can. Turning to Jude, she tried to make her face as neutral as possible, as if they were sitting beside a stream watching the ducks lazily swim on a summer afternoon. The witches have the upper hand. They're on their own turf, and they outnumber him 6-1. He could use a little help, don't you think? A lopsided grin appeared on Jude's face. I have to hand it to you humans. You might be more delicate than a wall made of paper, but you're not afraid to play the game of influence. You do remember that your leech tried to rip my head off earlier this evening, don't you? They looked back to the field in time to see the vampire use his strength to rip apart the noose of hair around his neck and flit away, only to return a second later, claws extended, and slice through the witch's hair close to her head. An O of surprise appeared on the witch's face. Her hands flew to her head, patting at the place where her braid had been moments before. Maz was back in front of his foes a moment later, swinging the handful of hair around his head in triumph, openly taunting his opponents. Jude laughed. Don't worry, it looks like the leech has things well in hand. Maybe he does. She'd no sooner thought that before a witch sent a bolt of green energy into the whirling hair. It transformed in an instant, no longer stringy and gray. The hair was becoming something different, something green and active. Vines were now encircling the vampire, wrapping around his body with lightning speed. The vines constrained his arms to his side,
and when they'd encircled his feet, they plunged into the ground, sticking fast and tipping Maz over in the process. The vines covered his head, cutting off his airways. They'll choke off his oxygen. Jude seemed to sense what she was thinking. Don't worry, Princess. He doesn't need to breathe. He's dead, remember? Hollie started at the tidbit of information. Dead, as in no need for air, no heartbeat, no pulse. The vampire had always seemed so alive, so full of power and energy. She hadn't really considered the fact that he was literally dead. The vampire was scrambling on the ground, the vines holding fast and starting to squeeze. She heard Maz let out a muffled shout of pain, his body writhing and flexing. She turned to Jude again, about to scream at him to help, but the vampire disappeared a moment later, vines and all. The witches stood firm in the center of the field, their heads swiveling to scan the area around him. Seconds passed, seconds that seemed longer than hours. Tension filled Hollie until she wanted to scream. Without warning, the vamp reappeared at last. Hollie let out a gasp when she saw that the vines were no longer wrapped around him, obscuring most of his body. They were now looped around his arm, coiled like a rope. He wasted no time tossing it like a lasso around the closest purple robe he could find. The hook-nosed witch screeched when the vine encircled her torso. The vampire flicked his wrist to tighten it, then yanked hard, pulling the old woman off her feet. Maz vanished, along with the vine and the woman trapped within it. There was a crash in the trees a few yards away from where Hollie stood. She looked up to find the witch dangling there, hands bound tightly and mouth stuffed with leaves. A shout from the battlefield drew her attention back, and she watched the vampire lasso another witch. Another crash in the canopy, another angry female dangling from the branches above them. Your vamp has a certain sense of artistry, doesn't he? There was a hint of admiration in Jude's voice. I think the tide may be turning against our ladies in purple. When the third witch landed in the treetops, the remaining witches regrouped, linking arms again and glowing with power. In tandem they lifted their arms, and the sky above them suddenly swirled with darkening clouds. Lightning flashed down on them, hitting each on their fingertips, charging them up with incredible energy. One spotted the vampire across the field and pointed at him, silver lightning arcing right toward him. Hollie held her breath, but at the last instant the vamp disappeared, only to reappear on the other side of the women. Another witch attempted to blast him, and again he shifted at the last second, the lightning passing through the space where he'd been to hit a tree behind him, slicing into the trunk and causing it to fall over with a magnificent crash. Only one witch remained with a silvery glow dancing on her fingertips. This time Maz couldn't avoid her attack. He appeared directly in front of the witches, quickly speeding around them to wrap all three of them in the remaining vines. When he crossed in front of the one with her charge at the ready, she reached out and zapped him. Maz stiffened as the bolts raged through him. He started to smoke, his hair standing on end, but he never let go of the vine. When the energy had run its course, the witch looked at him, incredulous. He gave her a smile that was all fang, smoke curling up from between his lips and tracing a ladder to the stars above. An instant later, the loud commotion above her let Hollie know that the witch had joined her colleagues. 6 women in purple robes dangled from the branches, each unable to talk or use their hands to cast their spells. Jude closed the distance between himself and Hollie. Putting a hand on her shoulder, he grinned. Looks like the leech is the winner. Aren't you a lucky girl? She frowned at him, then took a step back when a wind rushed past her. She turned to find Maz standing in front of her, his gaze intent. Jude began a slow clap, causing the vampire's eyes to flick in his direction. Maz stiffened, his lip curling up into a snarl. Hollie's eyes widened in alarm. I know how this looks, she began, assuming he was furious that she was once again in the company of the man she'd been sitting with in the tavern what felt like centuries ago. Are you really so idiotic, imp? Maz growled at Jude. You failed to heed my warnings earlier, but you won't make that mistake again. The centuries of torture Samael has planned for you will pale in comparison to what I'll do to you with my own claws. Tut tut, leech, he said. Not in front of the lady. Maz lost it, slashing out at the imp, who vanished before he could make contact.
Hollie gasped when Jude appeared behind her, his hands clamping onto her arms. "Say goodbye to your mate," he said, and before Hollie could react, she felt a rush of air and tumbled into darkness. Chapter 25. The space that a moment ago had held his mate was now empty. Maz's howl of rage echoed through the treetops, scaring a flock of birds into the sky. "She'd been right here, watching me take on the pesky hex flingers for hire." Maz hadn't exactly been happy to see her, showing up as she did right on the edge of the battlefield, but in another way he'd been delighted to set eyes on his mate again. Any time he was close to Hollie, his mind felt at peace, able to stop the torrent of worries about her safety and well-being. But when her being near him meant she was in danger, his mental calm was buffeted by an equal and opposite emotion. He had to protect his mate at all costs, which meant he wanted her far away from any battle he was fighting. "The bloody imp!" he growled, his anger cresting again. "He will pay!" First, he'd been next to her in the tavern, no doubt trying to gain her trust, only so he could betray it when he presented his mate to Ahriman to barter his freedom from Samael with someone who was equally as strong. It's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. His eyes were red, his claws at their full extension, his breathing ragged. It took everything inside him to get a handle on his rage and not rush off to Ahriman to pursue the imp across the Hell Realm. No one could teleport to within 50 miles of the Arshan's compound, which meant that even though Jude might make it to Ahriman, he wouldn't be able to reach the prince by magical means. He'd have to walk. Ahriman is a horrible realm, filled with perils. He was tense enough for a diamond to shatter by touching him, worrying about all the terrors that could befall his mate. She made it out of that hell once, he reminded himself, but it did little to curb his protective instinct. I can't rush off half-cocked again, even if the thought of Dallin touching my mate has me ready to separate his head from his neck. He'd only made mistakes when he'd rushed after Hollie, thinking he could behave in a way that earned her trust. I need to come up with a strategy before I pursue the imp this time, or I could end up making things worse. The vampire looked up to take in the witches hanging in the canopy above him. It was inspired work, the way he'd used their own magic against them. When a witch's spell rebounded, it doubled its damage back onto the person who'd done the casting. Although the spell hadn't technically rebounded, he'd used their own vines to bind them, making sure they couldn't cast any spells, while also knowing the vines would retain their strength until the witch that had created them released the spell with the correct word or gesture. If they can't move and can't speak, they can't banish their own spell. Satisfied that the women were no longer a threat for the moment, he turned his attention back to the shock he'd received when he'd seen Dallin standing next to his mate. Maz couldn't believe the imp planned to follow the same plan he'd revealed to the vampire back on Pluto. It seemed the height of foolishness, and yet it still might work. After all, he's got Hollie, and I don't. Not for long, he told himself. But I can't go to Ahriman alone and get past the Prince of Darkness's defenses. Maz knew he was marked as a minion of Samael, and although the two princes were brothers, bad blood had flowed between Ahriman and Samael for longer than Maz had been alive. The vampire considered which allies he could reach out to, but having been a lone wolf for centuries, none came readily to mind. The idea of trusting Tubo and his network of spies and connivers filled his stomach with knots. Who can I trust? The most accurate answer to his question was no one. Suddenly Maz's body went rigid. His mouth opened on a gasp, the agony sweeping through him some of the worst he'd known, but it was also familiar. Not now, he thought, his anxiety climbing another level until Maz was sure his mind would shatter. His eyes closed in pain as he waited for the inevitable. When he opened them a moment later, he found himself standing on a crumbling parapet on the highest tower of Pluto's massive castle keep. Samael, you have impeccably bad timing. Maz inclined his head to the Angel of Death, schooling his face to show no emotion. His master had the ability to summon him whenever he chose, and there was nothing Maz could do to prevent it. He was forced back to Pluto on Samael's whim. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, the Archon said before turning his back on Maz to stare out over the ruins of his realm. The vampire knew the question was rhetorical, so he said nothing. Hands crossed behind his back, he waited to find out why Samael had brought him here. The Archon enjoyed making people wait in silence. He knew it would make them squirm, would put them on edge enough to possibly make a mistake. Maz might have fallen for this gambit when he was a much younger vampire, but now he knew to wait it out. Long minutes passed, and although he felt antsy and impatient to get back to planning Hollie's rescue, Maz remained still, waiting for Samael to speak. Finally, the Angel of Death motioned him forward. The vampire joined him, looking out over the expanse of darkness that blanketed the Archon's realm. Samael suddenly got straight to the point. "Where is Dallin?" "I tracked him to Samothrace. He was hiding in plain sight among the witches." It was better to give Samael as much truth as one had to offer. The powerful hellspawn was eons old when most of the realms within the web were new or hadn't even been dreamt up yet. The prince could often tell when he was being lied to. "Witches, eh?" Samael's face was impassive, and as he'd often done over the millennia, Maz watched for any clue as to the direction of the Archon's thoughts. As usual, there were none. "Does that mean he is back in his cell, then?" Maz knew better than to lie about something that could be so easily tracked. Although it had never been confirmed, the vampire suspected that Samael was able to sense the presence of his creatures while they were in his realm. Maz hoped that this ability was confined to Pluto, because if Samael could keep tabs on him across the web, it meant he already knew the answers to all the questions he was asking. "No, my prince." Maz waited for his master to express his displeasure, wondering what form it would take this time. Torture? Confinement? Something even worse, like the true death? Samael turned to him. "You are aware that I don't like to be disappointed, aren't you?" At Maz's nod, the Archon's eyes narrowed. The prince put a hand on his shoulder. "You are one of my most trusted servants, Mazik. I have raised you as one of my own. You are a reflection of me. I've given you a long leash. Just be certain it doesn't end up being twisted enough to hang you." Maz inclined his head again, wondering if he'd been dismissed. Expecting to find himself back on Samothrace, where he'd been before the Archon had summoned him, he became concerned when he remained on Pluto, Samael's gaze lingering on him. "The thing about reflections," Samael said for a moment, removing his hand, "is that they can crack and sometimes shatter. Be mindful that you aren't cut by the shards." With those words, Samael released his summons, and Maz was returned to Samothrace instantly. The vampire took a moment to get his bearings. So much had happened in the space of the last 10 minutes. I was attacked by linked witches, watched my mate kidnapped by the imp, and then faced a summons from the Angel of Death. Ignoring the women writhing in the treetops above him, he ran his hands over his hair, attempting to soothe the riot of emotions inside him. The need to rush off to Ahrimanabad was like a shout inside his brain, a loop that wouldn't shut off. Hands shaking, Maz went back to pondering his next move. Her friends should know of her circumstance. The thought popped into his head suddenly, and Maz wondered where it had come from. Hollie's friends had proved to be nothing but nuisances over the past weeks, inserting themselves to block his access to his mate whenever possible. He shouldn't care if they knew where Hollie was. In fact, it was to his advantage that they not know. But Maz realized that he had to stop playing the long game. Mates were bound for eternity, and that meant an eternity of discomfort if he wasn't able to make peace with Hollie's friends. The vampire was reeling at the changes that finding his mate had wrought. Hiding things from my master, being unable to sleep or eat or function without being near her, becoming willing to tolerate fae and witches and whatever other creatures had forged a friendship with her. He wasn't certain what the outcome of all these transformations might be, but he worried that he'd face an uphill battle, or worse, if Samael finds out. Maz had yet to figure out how to both claim his mate while simultaneously not alerting his master to that fact. It seemed like an impossible task, but if he had any hope for a real relationship with Hollie, he also had to believe that
There was a way to claim her without having Samael interfere. The vampire was still reeling from the summoning, especially the remark Samael had made before sending him back to cemeteries. The thing about reflections is that they can crack and sometimes shatter. Be mindful that you aren't cut by the shards. Reflection. Maz's mind slipped back to the round room with the mirrors where he'd finally broken through Hollie's walls. I kissed her. Then I screwed everything up. After Hollie had been yanked through the crack the witch had created and the hole was sealed up, Maz had remained trapped, his abilities still not functioning. He's raged his way around the room, smashing against the mirrored wall over and over, but the cracks had never stopped sealing themselves faster than he could reshatter them. And then the room had spun away from him. Maz found himself hurtling through darkness. When he'd landed, he'd been back on Samothrace, in the borderland forest, with no idea why he'd suddenly been returned there. At the time, he'd thought that perhaps the realm had a time limit for occupation, evicting its inhabitants after a set amount of time. Another theory was that the owner of the pocket dimension had discovered his presence and evicted him by means of a banishment spell. But Maz should have ended up back at the tavern if that were true, and not in the gloomy woods. He'd put aside his hypotheses and focused on finding his mate again, but before he'd had a chance to travel into the city, the witches had started appearing, and he'd known that a battle was brewing. But now, analyzing his master's words, Maz stumbled across a very different theory. He hadn't been evicted from the space, but rescued. He froze, every muscle tensing. Samael knows about the room, and if he knows about the room, then he knows about Hollie. That thought made his already cold insides turn to ice. I can't think about that now, he told himself. If Samael knows, any shot I have of claiming my mate and my happily ever after for eternity is gone. I've got to focus. The only thing that matters right now is finding Hollie. And the best way to do that is to team up with her friends. It wasn't an easy thought by any means, but Maz could feel that it was the right one. They've managed to thwart me at every turn so far. Maybe once they're on my side, I'll be able to accomplish the impossible. Without any more hesitation, he traveled, appearing in the common room of the Bubbling Brew Tavern. The room was empty, save for the interfering witch and foul-mouthed warrior Fae, her winged companion, and a very sleepy barkeep with a tail. Since he had landed in the shadows, no one had yet discovered that Maz had returned. The witch and the warrior were engaged in a heated battle of words, and the vampire wondered whether they were civil enough to work together. He was distracted by their back and forth, so he didn't notice that the other Fae had approached him. Her diamond-bladed knife was at his throat before he had time to react.
Where is she?
Maz lifted his hands in a gesture of surrender. I don't have her. The imp took her. But I'm going to get her back, and I need your help. The Fae's eyes were cold.
Imp?
Maz nodded, then realized what a mistake it was as the blade sliced into his flesh. A second later it healed. But that didn't mean it was painless. The man you saw at the dice table? The annoying chipper one who can't stay away from games of chance?
The one you choked out before our magical entanglement entangled you?
The very one, he confirmed. I know where he is headed, but I cannot go there without backup, so I've come to you for assistance. You are bold, she whispered, shaking her head, but he noticed that the corners of her lips were turning upward.
She needs someone bold.
Maz let out a ragged breath. She understands. Will you help? Before she could answer, the other Fae called to her across the room.
Are you talking to ghosts now, Taylor? No, to our newest ally.
She dropped her knife and stepped back. Maz took that as his cue to step out of the shadows. The witch gasped, her eyes wide in surprise. The warrior Fae, on the other hand, leapt into action, her sword drawn and headed for his guts in moments. Maz pivoted at the last moment, and the Fae's sword missed him, but just barely.
Stop!
The Fae called, Taylor shouted.
Phaedra, he's here to ask for our help.
Ha! Phaedra said, then swung again. Maz used his ability to travel across the room. She's telling the truth. Hollie's been kidnapped, and I need your assistance to rescue her.
Hands touched his back, sending the sting of 1,000 needles into the skin in that spot. "What have you done to my sisters?" hissed the witch into his ear. "If I find out you've harmed them, I will personally drive the stake that ends you through your black heart." "I have not harmed them. They're tied up in the woods. You can go and see for yourself." Phaedra eyed him. "You didn't hurt them? Didn't drain them?" He shook his head in reply. "I understand your apprehension, believe me. I would not ask if it were not for Hollie's benefit. We both want the same thing. Hollie's safe. Will you help me?" "Never," Phaedra growled, raising her sword again, but her fellow Fae blocked her. "It's Hollie. She's in danger. We cannot abandon her, and you know that, even if it means working with the vampire." Disgust filled the warrior Fae's face. "You are asking too much of me," she told Taylor. "Our kind do not form alliances with the likes of him." His impatience swelling, Maz decided that he'd made a mistake. "As you will," he said stiffly. "I can handle this alone. Consider this a courtesy call to inform my mate's friends. I won't make another." The vampire was on the verge of traveling away and heading to Ahrimanabad alone, but at the last second Phaedra reached out to stop him. "This alliance is only temporary," she told him. "As soon as Hollie is back, I'm going to be the one staking you, leech." Maz inclined his head in understanding. "We must act immediately or risk losing her forever." An alliance formed. The Fae and the vampire set out to rescue the woman that would be his mate, or his end. Epilogue.
"Are you certain you can trust her? Have you seen the way she looks at him? You had more coin in your purse before you left the room with him still in it, and he did show up with a new bauble around his neck. He must have stolen what was rightfully yours. No one truly cares about you. What have you done in your miserable life to improve your circumstances? Dirt you were, and dirt you will be again. Might as well hasten the process."
The Lady of Whispers fell silent, her consciousness merging again with her proper physical form. Exhaustion weighed down her shoulders, and she longed only for a little rest, a little privacy before she had to return to her duties, to her whispers. She materialized in her most cherished space, a place she'd kept secret for ages. The moment her feet touched the sumptuous carpet, she knew something was wrong.
"I've had visitors."
Scanning the small space she'd always considered cozy, the Lady of Whispers felt genuine unease for the first time in centuries. She stared at her mirrored walls, surprised to find evidence of a breach. The pocket realm had been designed with a defense mechanism that would not allow any uninvited guest to pass through them, but it seemed someone or something had found a way around her security protocols. Although the walls appeared as smooth and unblemished as always, her trained eyes were able to see the magical residue, a shimmering hole in her defenses. Her reflection looked back at her, wrinkled forehead, narrowed eyes, and a mouth compressed into a thin line. Worry was inscribed on her features and the lines of her body. Not only had she built up layers of powerful protection magic around her realm, but she'd also hidden it deep within the web and taken pains that no one could discover its location without being told.
"And yet, look around me."
The place had been ransacked. Books were torn off shelves, chairs pushed over on their sides. Half the drawers in the tall dresser were yanked open, her most prized possessions strewn all over surfaces in careful displays or in random piles.
What were the intruders looking for?
Anxiety pricked her. Seeking relief, she carefully channeled the energy required to mend what had been broken. It took patience repairing the delicate mirror, and the spells protecting her realm once again by magical means. By the time she'd finished, her tiredness had gone past exhaustion. She was dead on her feet. She couldn't rest, not yet. Someone else needed to be told about this development. Standing in front of her mirror wall, she lifted her hand and passed it slowly over the surface. The wall wavered, its surface becoming liquid before resolving itself into an image of her son. He looked up at her, surprised. On his side of the reflection, he would be seeing a translucent bubble about the size of her fist that had appeared out of nowhere. Inside that bubble was her tiny image, as she was now. It was an efficient means of conversation without having to risk putting them in the same room together at the same time. "Mother!" he said, his eyebrow arching in confusion. You haven't contacted me in centuries. Is there a reason you've changed that? His tone was a little stiff, and she quickly detected the hurt lurking in his words. I've been so focused on recovering the son I lost that I've forgotten to tend to the one I still have. I'm sorry, little one, she told him, using the pet name she'd given him when he was just an infant, when there had been 2 little ones. I've been distracted by the search. She didn't have to explain what she meant by that, but her admission earned no sympathy. You've been searching for millennia. Perhaps it is time you found a new hobby. The coolness in his voice troubled her. You know I cannot do that. No matter how many realms she'd searched, and they had been legion, she had been unable to find the son who'd been parted from her so long ago. But I haven't searched every realm, and so I cannot give up. He could be anywhere, hidden in a realm that cannot be located like mine. Although it was hard to hold on to hope after such a long time of disappointment, she knew that as a mother she'd never be able to rest until she found out what happened to her lost little one. This is not why I called you today, she told him, forcing her tone to remain neutral. Have you experienced anything strange of late? Something out of the ordinary? Anyone following you? His eyes widened. I cannot name anything specifically. What has you asking that question? My pocket realm has been breached. It was torn apart, and the culprits are a mystery to me. I had hoped that maybe you'd have an idea who might be to blame. He shook his head. I should come to you, he told her. Protect you. Watch over you. The lady's heart warmed at her son's words. It was something she wanted very badly, to hold her son again, both of them. But she had to rest, and to do that, she needed to be alone. That is very kind, and I hope we will be together soon, but it would be too risky to see one another now. She couldn't help frowning when she saw his face harden. So be it. Her son considered her eccentric, and she knew he was frustrated by her caution. But he does not know what I do. He cannot feel the darkness encroaching on the edge of things. The prophecy is nearly at hand, she said, as calmly as she could. I can feel it, and soon the entire web will shake under the weight of it. There are those who would seek to thwart fate by harming you, harming me. He nodded, but his eyes were looking past her, and she could feel the wall coming up between them. You are a wonderful son, and I was blessed the day you came into my life. Thank you, Mother, he said dutifully, but did not return the sentiment. She hid her disappointment, blowing him a kiss before saying farewell. When the mirror before her returned to displaying her own reflection, she turned away, confronting the mess someone had made of her private domain. Perhaps there is some clue to whoever invaded my privacy among the wreckage. She began meticulously sorting through the mess, returning things to rights while looking for any evidence of the interloper. It took a few hours, but eventually she found something that didn't belong. Gingerly, she plucked a single hair off the page of a book that had been opened to a poem addressed to the Raven Goddess. The hair shone in the candlelight. It was long and red, and it definitely did not belong to her. I've got you, she said, anticipation filling her, and you will regret desecrating my sanctuary. The end. This has been Fae Wilds Series Book 7, The Vampire Tales, Dusk Shadows, written by W.J.May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall.